She didn't knock. She just pushed the door open and walked straight to his bed, her hands already reaching for the cloth, already wringing water from the basin, already pressing cool linen to a forehead burning hot as summer iron. Not the doctor, not the neighbors, not one soul from Red Hollow, just her Amelia Whitaker. The woman they called useless, the woman they laughed at kneeling beside the strongest man in the county, while he shooken like he might never stop. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. The lamp had burned down to its last inch of oil when Amelia Whitaker finally allowed herself to sit. She had been on her feet since the moment she heard. Since old Pete Calloway had come stumbling into the Red Hollow diner at 6:30 in the evening, his hat in his hands and his face the color of ash, saying that Colton Hayes was laid up bad at the ranch and nobody was going out there on account of the rumors about what was making him sick. Amelia had been elbow-deep in bread dough at the time. She had flour on her wrists and sweat along her hairline and 3 more loaves waiting to go in the oven. She had listened to Pete without moving. Then she had covered the dough, turned the damper on the stove down low, untied her apron, and gone to the back room to collect her medicine bag. "You can't be serious," said Dora Hatch from her stool at the counter. Dora said most things from a stool at the counter. It was her preferred position for offering opinions nobody had asked for. "Amelia, for heaven's sake, you don't even know the man." "I know he's sick," Amelia said. "Everyone's saying it might be catching. Everyone's been saying a lot of things for as long as I've been in this town," Amelia said. "Hasn't killed me yet." She heard Dora suck in a breath behind her. She heard the scrape of a stool, the small outraged sounds of a woman who considered herself the authority on what was appropriate. Amelia paid none of it any attention. She packed the bag the way her mother had taught her willow bark. Clean linen, a jar of broth she had put up 3 days ago, a small tin of the salve she made herself from herbs she grew behind the diner. She packed it the way a woman packs when she means to stay. "You'll ruin what little reputation you have left," Dora called after her. Amelia was already out the door. The night was warm and heavy with the smell of dry grass and distant rain. The road to the Hayes Ranch was 8 miles of hard-packed dirt that turned to loose rock closer to the creek crossing. And Amelia made it in just under an hour on the old roan gelding she kept stabled behind the diner. She rode the way she did everything without ceremony, without complaint, leaning slightly forward against the horse's neck and letting the animal find its own pace in the dark. She had ridden this road only twice before, once in her first week in Red Hollow, when she had gone out to ask about a cooking position and been turned away at the gate by a hand who said Mr. Hayes kept his own cook once again 6 months later, delivering a special order of pies to a ranch hand who had paid in advance and then had not shown up to collect. She remembered the gate. She remembered the long fence line. She remembered thinking, both times, that the ranch was the kind of place that looked it belonged to a man who did not want visitors. She was not a visitor tonight. She didn't know exactly what she was. But she rode through the gate and tied the roan at the post and knocked twice on the front door before pushing it open, because there had been no answer, and she was not about to stand on ceremony when a man might be dying on the other side of it. The inside of the house told her everything she needed to know. The fire had burned low. There was a water pail on the table, but the cloth beside it was dry, which meant no one had been tending him. The smell in the room was the particular smell of high fever, close and sweet and wrong, in a way that made her stomach tighten. Colton Hayes was in the back bedroom. She had seen him before. Of course, everyone in Red Hollow had seen him. He came into town twice a month for supplies, sometimes less. He was the kind of man people noticed not because he worked at being noticed, but because of his size and his quiet and the particular way he moved, like a man who has learned that careful is better than fast. He was tall. He was broad through the shoulders. He had the kind of face that had been handsome once and had weathered into something better than handsome, something harder and more honest. His hair was dark brown, gone gray at the temples. His hands, even at rest, looked like they had spent 30 years earning their calluses. He was not looking like any of that now. He was flat on his back in a tangle of sheets. His color all wrong, his breathing the shallow and rapid kind that Amelia recognized as the body working too hard to do a simple thing. His eyes were half open, but he wasn't seeing anything in front of him. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere behind his own fever. Talking to people who weren't in the room. "Clara," he said, as Amelia set her bag on the chair beside the bed. "Clara, the gate." Amelia didn't ask who Clara was. She wrung out the cloth and pressed it to his forehead and said, "Low and steady, you're all right. I've got you. Lie still." He didn't seem to hear her. But he stopped moving. She worked through the night. 2 years ago, Amelia Whitaker had arrived in Red Hollow on the Tuesday stage out of Billings with a carpet bag, a medicine chest, and a folded newspaper advertisement that she had read so many times the creases were worn soft as cloth. Widower, rancher, established property, seeks capable woman of good character for marriage and partnership. Write to Box 14, Red Hollow, Montana, she had written. He had written back 3 letters, careful and plain, asking about her experience keeping house, her cooking, her health. She had answered honestly. She had not sent a photograph because he had not asked for one. She had thought during those weeks of letters that she was communicating with a man who understood that a farm wife was a partner, not an ornament, and who was measuring her accordingly. She had been wrong. The man at the stage stop had not been Colton Hayes. It had been his ranch foreman, a wiry man named Ed Briggs, sent to collect her and bring her out to be looked over. Amelia had climbed down from the stage in her best dress, blue cotton, fitted at the waist, with a collar she had ironed herself that morning at the boarding house in Billings, and she had watched Ed Briggs look at her the way a man looks at livestock that has come in below expectation. "Mr. Hayes is at the ranch," Ed said. "He asked me to bring you out, of course," Amelia said. She had her bag in one hand and her medicine chest in the other, and she was not going to let Ed Briggs or anyone else see that she already understood what was coming. Colton Hayes had met them in the yard. He was just as she had imagined from his letters composed. Capable looking, not a man given to easy expression. He had looked at her. She had looked back. Neither of them had said anything for a moment that lasted about half a heartbeat too long. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "You had a good tolerable," she said. "Come in and sit down." She had sat at his kitchen table and drunk the coffee a silent hand brought out, and waited for him to say whatever he was working up to say. He had said it in about 3 minutes, which she gave him some credit for. "I'm sorry to have brought you all this way," he said. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about what I was looking for." "What kind of misunderstanding?" Amelia asked, though she already knew. "I was looking for a woman who could—" He stopped. He was not, she could tell, a man who found this kind of conversation easy. He wasn't enjoying it. That was something. "I was thinking of someone more spare," Amelia said. He didn't deny it. She had to give him that too. "I'll pay for your stage back to Billings," he said. "And a week's boarding while you make arrangements." "It's the least I can do." "That's generous," Amelia said. She set her coffee cup down. "I appreciate it." She had not cried until she was back on the stage to town. And she had not let herself cry for long because crying was a luxury she had never been able to afford. She had arrived in Red Hollow with $14, a medicine chest, and a reputation she hadn't had long enough to ruin. She had stayed anyway, not because she was stubborn. Or not only because she was stubborn. She had stayed because the diner needed a cook, and she needed work, and because going back to Billings meant going back to nothing. And nothing was a destination she had already tried. So she had taken the cooking job. She had gotten up at 4 every morning and lit the diner stove and started the biscuits and put on the coffee, and by the time Pearl Dawson unlocked the front door at 6, Amelia had already been working for 2 hours. She was good at her work. She had always been good at her work, cooking, baking. The particular arithmetic of making something from very little. Her biscuits were the lightest in the county. Her pies were the reason the diner stayed open on slow weeks. Her bread was the kind of bread that made people stop mid-sentence and take another piece. Red Hollow knew all of this. It didn't stop them from knowing the other thing first. That's the one who came out on the stage, looking for a husband, they said. The big one. Colton Hayes wouldn't have her. It followed her like weather. She heard it at the general store and at the church social and once. Memorably, from a child who couldn't have been older than 8 and was repeating something he'd heard at home. She heard it often enough that she stopped flinching when she heard it, which she supposed was a kind of progress. She had not spoken to Colton Hayes again after that morning at his kitchen table. She had seen him, of course he came into the diner for supplies. And once or twice he had been there when she brought the bread out from the kitchen. But he never came to the counter when she was at it. He was not cruel about it. He was simply absent, in the deliberate way that men are absent when they are trying to avoid having to apologize for something they are not sorry for. She did not hate him for it. She had turned that possibility over a few times early on and found that it didn't take root. He had been honest with her. That was more than most people managed. What she had not expected was the bread. 2 weeks after her arrival, a hand from the Hayes Ranch had come in and bought a loaf the large sourdough she made on Thursdays. She thought nothing of it. A week later, the same hand came back for another. Then the Thursday after that, there was no hand. There was Colton Hayes himself, standing at the counter in his work clothes with his hat in his hands, looking at the shelves. Last one, Amelia said, and put it on the counter. He paid without looking at her. She didn't make it easy on him or hard. She took the coins and said, "There'll be more Thursday," and that was all. He came back Thursday. It became a pattern without either of them deciding it would be. Thursday mornings, Colton Hayes came in for bread. He never stayed longer than it took to make the transaction. He never said anything beyond what was necessary, but he came back every week, and after a while Amelia noticed things. She noticed that he always finished the bread before the end of the week, which a ranch that size would do easily, but she noticed it because it meant he wasn't letting it go stale or go to the hands. He was eating it himself. She noticed that he looked at her not the way men in the diner looked at her. Not with that particular combination of pity and dismissal, but the way a careful man looks at something he is trying to understand. She noticed, one Thursday in October, that his coat had a tear along the left shoulder seam that had been clumsily mended and then opened up again. And without thinking, she said, "I can fix that if you leave it." He had looked at her for a moment that stretched about 2 seconds too long. Then he'd said, "I wouldn't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," she said. "I'll have it done by Saturday." He had left the coat. He had picked it up Saturday. He had said, "Thank you, Miss Whitaker," with enough weight behind it that she understood he meant more than the coat. She had said, "Anytime, Mr. Hayes," and meant more than the coat in return. The fever broke near dawn. Amelia knew the moment it happened. She had been watching for it, the particular change in a sick person's breathing. The way the skin shifts from papery and dry to something closer to human. She had her hand on his wrist, checking his pulse the way her mother had taught her, and she felt the change before she saw it in his face. Colton Hayes let out a long, slow breath. His body went from rigid to loose. The shaking stopped. Amelia took the cloth from his forehead, wrung it out, pressed a clean one in its place. She checked his breathing. She checked the wound on his side, a gash from the fence post he'd gone through during the storm. 3 days ago now, badly cleaned and starting to turn, but not so far gone that it couldn't be brought back. She had cleaned it properly when she arrived, the way she'd been taught, and covered it with a poultice of her own making. It had held through the night. She sat back in the chair and let herself feel the exhaustion for the first time since she'd walked through the door. The light was coming gray through the window. Outside she could hear the ranch waking up, the distant sounds of the hands starting their morning. Animals moving in the barn, a door somewhere on the far side of the property. Inside the room it was quiet and warm and smelled of the herbs she'd burned and the broth she'd heated, and the simple, particular smell of a sick person coming back to the right side of the line. She should leave before the house woke up. She knew that. She had thought about it all night, the arithmetic of being a woman alone in a man's house. What it would look like, what it would cost her. She had made her peace with it somewhere around 2 in the morning when the fever had spiked again, and she had understood that if she left, he might not make it to sunrise. She had stayed, and now it was nearly sunrise. And he was breathing evenly, and she was so tired she could feel it in her back teeth. She was starting to gather her things when he spoke. "You're real," he said. His voice was rough from 2 days without proper water. "Thought I was dreaming." "You're not dreaming," she said. "How do you feel?" He took a moment to assess the question, which she appreciated. Men who answered fine reflexively were men who didn't trust you with the truth. "Like something heavy sat on me for a week," he said. "That's about right," she said. "Your fever broke an hour ago. You'll want broth when you feel up to it. There's some on the stove. Your wound is going to need watching for another few days. But I don't think it'll go septic now." He was quiet for a moment. She was folding the extra linen, not looking at him. "Who sent you?" he asked. "Nobody," she said. "Then why did you come?" She considered the question. She had turned it over all night, in the long, quiet hours between checking his temperature and keeping the fire. And she had an answer ready, not a rehearsed one, but the true one, which was the only kind she ever gave. "Because someone should have," she said. He was quiet again. She glanced up and found him watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, not the careful blank that was his public face, and not the fever-confused openness of the night. Something between the two. Something more honest than either. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Amelia," she said. "I think we're past Miss Whitaker." Something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "It was gone too quickly to be sure, Amelia," he said. "You've been here all night." "I have. You should get some sleep." "I will," she said. "After I make sure the hands know what to watch for. And you've kept down a cup of broth." He didn't argue with her. She noticed that too. She was heating the broth when she heard the front door open. She didn't turn around right away, she had learned. Growing up, that turning around too fast was a sign of nervousness. And she had made a point of not being nervous in front of people who were looking for reasons to dismiss her. It was a woman. Amelia knew that before she turned around. She knew it from the sound of the step and the pause in the doorway. The particular pause of a woman deciding something. The woman who stood in the doorway of Colton Hayes' kitchen was about 45. Dressed well for 7 in the morning, with her dark hair already pinned and her back the kind of straight that didn't come from good posture but from long practice of making sure other people knew they were being looked down on. "Who are you?" the woman said. "I'm the woman who kept Mr. Hayes alive through the night," Amelia said. She kept her voice level. She was stirring the broth. "Who are you?" The pause that followed that question was very satisfying. "Margaret Collins," the woman said. "I'm a friend of the family. I would have come last night." "But what?" Amelia said. She turned around then, ladle in hand, and looked at Margaret Collins with the straightforward attention she gave everything. "He was sick. You knew. There was a reason you didn't come, Mrs. Collins, and I don't think it was anything that would reflect well on you. So maybe you'd rather not finish that sentence." Margaret Collins's face went through several things very quickly. Surprise, indignation, a recalibration. "I don't know who you think you are," she said. "I know exactly who I am," Amelia said. "I'm the cook from the Red Hollow Diner. Everybody in this town knows who I am. I'm the big woman Colton Hayes wouldn't marry 2 years ago." That's been the whole of my biography in Red Hollow since the day I arrived. She set the ladle down and picked up the broth pan. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to get this to him while it's still hot. You're welcome to stay and help with the morning. There's a list of things his wound needs on the table. She walked past Margaret Collins with the broth pan and didn't look back. Colton managed half a cup before he fell asleep again, which was the right amount. Amelia left the rest on the table within arm's reach and checked his forehead one more time, cool, or near enough, and straightened the sheets and picked up her bag. She met Ed Briggs coming through the front door as she was going out. Ed Briggs, who had been the one to meet her at the stage that first day, who had looked at her the way he'd looked at livestock. He stopped when he saw her. She watched the recognition move across his face, and with it, something she hadn't expected, something that looked beneath the surprise like guilt. "Miss Whitaker," he said. He took his hat off, which surprised her. "Mr. Briggs," she said. "I didn't know you were." He stopped. He's going to be fine," she said. "The fever broke an hour ago. His wound needs to be checked every 4 hours and changed morning and evening. I've left instructions." She started to move past him. "Make sure he drinks the rest of that broth when he wakes up." "Miss Whitaker," he said it quietly. She stopped. "I heard you were the only one who came." "Word travels fast," she said. "It does." He turned his hat in his hands. He was not a man built for this kind of conversation, and he was suffering through it. She could tell. "I should have." "Yes," she said. "You should have. Most people should have." She looked at him for a moment. "But you'll have a chance to do better from here. That's something." She walked out into the morning and untied the roan and rode back toward Red Hollow with the sun coming up behind the mountains and the whole of the county still and golden encounter her. And she did not look back at the Hayes ranch, not because she didn't want to, but because she had learned, a long time ago, that looking back too soon is how you trip on what's in front of you. The diner was already open when she got back. Pearl Dawson looked up from behind the counter with an expression that held, in roughly equal parts, relief and the kind of burning curiosity that makes small towns what they are. "You were there all night," Pearl said. "It was not a question." Amelia said. She tied the roan, came inside, went directly to the back room, and put on a clean apron. "People are talking," Pearl said, following her. "People are always talking," Amelia said. "Hand me the flour, Amelia." Pearl's voice had shifted into something quieter. Pearl was not a cruel woman. She was a practical one, which sometimes amounted to the same thing, but not today. "Are you all right?" Amelia stopped. She had the flour in her hands and the day stretched out in front of her, and she was so tired she could feel the floor swaying slightly under her feet, though she knew it wasn't really swaying. "I'm fine," she said. "You don't have to, Pearl." She set the flour down and turned around. "I'm going to need about 20 minutes before I start the bread. If you can handle the counter until then, I'd appreciate it." Pearl looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Take 30, and went back out front. Amelia sat down on the stool in the back room and put her face in her hands and let herself be tired for exactly 30 minutes. She didn't cry. She didn't replay the night in her head. She just sat, in the particular way of a person who has used up a great deal of themselves and needs a moment before they can be full again. Then she got up, washed her face, tied her apron, and started the bread. She did not think about what Colton Hayes had said to her as she left. "I know you," because she didn't know what it meant, and she had learned not to build things on foundations she couldn't verify. She did not think about the way he had looked at her in those last clear minutes before he'd fallen asleep again, or the particular weight in his voice when he'd said her name. She thought about bread. She thought about the cracked leather on the diner's front stool that she kept meaning to ask Pearl to fix. She thought about the list of supplies she needed to order before the end of the month. She thought about practical things. Practical things had gotten her through everything she'd ever had to get through. And she was not about to stop trusting them now. The bread came out well. It always did. She did not allow herself, not even once, to look toward the road that ran south out of Red Hollow. The road that eventually became the track that led to the Hayes Ranch gate. She did not allow herself to wonder if he was thinking about her. But she put an extra loaf aside on Thursday, just in case. The extra loaf sat on the shelf until Saturday. Amelia told herself it was nothing. She told herself she had simply made one too many, which happens sometimes, and she had set it aside because throwing away good bread was a sin her mother had never permitted, and neither would she. She told herself this on Thursday evening, and again on Friday morning. And by Saturday afternoon, she had told herself enough times that she almost believed it. Then the door opened and it was not Colton Hayes. It was a girl. 9 years old, maybe 10, with dark braids and serious eyes, and the particular posture of a child who has learned to be careful in unfamiliar places. She was wearing a dress that was clean but too short at the hem. And her boots were good quality but needed resoling. And she stood in the doorway of the diner, with chin up and her hands clasped in front of her, the way a child stands when they have been coached 8 on how to behave in public. "Are you Miss Whitaker?" the girl said. "I am," Amelia said. A pause. "Clara Hayes." Amelia set down the dishcloth she was holding. "Mr. Hayes's daughter?" "His ward," the girl said, with a precision that suggested she had corrected this particular error before. "He took me in when I was 4. My parents died." She said this with the matter-of-fact steadiness of a child who has been carrying that fact long enough that it no longer cuts the same way. "He wanted me to come and say thank you. For what you did. He could have come himself," Amelia said. And then wished she hadn't, because it was not the child's fault, and the child's face didn't deserve what flickered like it, a complicated mix of loyalty and honesty. "He wanted to," Clara said. "He's not supposed to ride yet." Ed wouldn't let him hitch the wagon either. She unclasped her hands and reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. He wrote it down. Amelia took the paper. She unfolded it. The handwriting was the same as the letters she had read 2 years ago, plain and careful. Each letter formed with the deliberateness of a man who had not had much schooling, but had decided that was no excuse for illegibility. "Miss Whitaker, Amelia, I am told I was not myself for most of the night you were here. I am told you were there regardless. I don't know how to repay that. But I would like the chance to try, if you would allow it. C. Hayes." She read it twice, then she folded it back up and put it in her apron pocket and looked at Clara, who was watching her with those serious, careful eyes. "How is he?" Amelia asked. "Grumpy," Clara said. "He doesn't like being told to rest. Most men don't. Ed says he'll ask men questions." "What kind of questions?" Clara tilted her head. "About you," she said simply. Amelia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Would you like a piece of pie while I wrap up that bread?" Clara looked at the pie case with the controlled interest of a child who has been raised not to seem greedy. "Yes, please," she said. Clara Hayes ate her pie with the focused attention of someone who understood that good things deserve to be taken seriously. And while she ate, she talked. She talked the way children talk when they have been given permission to, without particular structure. Moving from one thing to the next in the associative way of a mind that has not yet learned to edit itself for an audience. She talked about the ranch, about the horses, particularly a roan mare named Duchess, who she was learning to ride and who had an opinion about everything. About Ed Briggs, who was gruff and had no idea how to talk to children but tried his best. About the bunkhouse cook, a man named Haverford, who made acceptable beans but whose biscuits were, in Clara's frank assessment, like eating chalk wrapped in sadness. Amelia found herself smiling. "That bad he forgets the salt," Clara said. "Every time. Ed says it's because he doesn't taste as he goes." "You have to taste as you go," Amelia agreed. "That's what I said." Clara scraped the last of the pie filling from her plate with the careful thoroughness of someone making sure nothing was wasted. "Colton says you made the bread he buys on Thursdays." "I do. He says it's the best bread he's ever eaten." Clara looked up. "He doesn't say things like that about food usually. He eats what's in front of him and says thank you, and that's about the end of it." She paused. "So I thought you must be doing something right." Amelia wrapped the extra loaf in brown paper and tied it with string. "Take that back to him," she said. "Tell him I said he's welcome. And that I'll check on the wound in a few days if he'll permit it." Clara took the package. She was halfway to the door when she turned back. "Miss Whitaker," she said. "The ladies in town. The ones who say things." She held the package with both hands and looked at Amelia with an honesty that was not unkind. Just very direct. "Colton doesn't care about any of that. In case you were wondering." Amelia looked at her for a moment. "How do you know?" "Because I asked him," Clara said. "After the first Thursday he came back. I asked him why he kept going back to the same diner when there are two others closer to the ranch." She lifted one shoulder in a small, careful shrug. "He said because the bread was worth the trip. And Colton Hayes doesn't make trips that aren't worth it." She pushed through the door and was gone. Amelia stood behind the counter for a full 30 seconds without moving. Then Pearl came out from the back and said, "Was that who I think it was?" "It was Clara Hayes," Amelia said. "And that look on your face?" "There's no look on my face," Amelia said. And went back to work. She went out to the ranch on Tuesday, as she'd said she would. She told herself it was purely medical. The wound needed checking. She had said she would check it. She was a woman who did what she said she would do. And that was the entire beginning and end of the matter. She brought the medicine bag and a jar of fresh broth and nothing else. And she rode out in the mid-morning with the sun already high and the grass on either side of the road the color of dry straw. Ed Briggs met her at the gate. He had his hat off before she'd even dismounted, which told her something had changed in him since Saturday morning, since the moment in the doorway when she had said you should have, and he had stood there, holding his hat and not arguing. "Miss Whitaker, he's on the porch." "Is he supposed to be on the porch?" "No," Ed said. "But I stopped arguing about it an hour ago." Colton Hayes was sitting in the straight-backed chair at the far end of the porch, which was close enough to the door that he could get back inside if he needed to, and far enough from it that he was technically not in bed. He had won that argument with himself, and from the look of it, was satisfied with the outcome. He was not doing anything. He was simply sitting, watching the yard, in the way of a man who has been made to be still, and has decided to make it a deliberate act rather than a helpless one. He heard her come up the steps and turned his head. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said. "You did." He looked at her the way he had looked at her in those last clear minutes before sleep, in the gray morning after the fever broke that careful, assessing look that held something warmer underneath, like a fire that hasn't been fed in a long time but hasn't gone entirely cold. "I wasn't sure you'd mean it. I generally mean what I say." "Mr. Hayes Colton," he said. She had not expected that. She took it without showing anything on her face, the way she had learned to take most things. "Colton," she said, "let me look at the wound." The wound was healing cleanly. She had been afraid in the part of her mind she kept for things she didn't want to look at directly that she had done something wrong the first night, that in her exhaustion she had missed something or failed to clean it properly. She hadn't. The edge of the cut was knitting together the way it should. Pink and firm, no heat in the surrounding skin. She pressed around it carefully, watching his face for what his expression would admit. He didn't move, he didn't make a sound. The only indication that any of it registered was a slight tightening at the corner of his jaw, which he noted and respected. "You're doing well," she said. "Keep it dry another week. I'll leave more of the salve with Ed. Stay for coffee," he said. She looked up from the bandage. He was looking out at the yard, not at her, which made it easier for both of them. "I have to get back," she said. "Half an hour," he said. "I'd like to." He stopped. He was not a man who made requests easily. She could see the effort of it. "I'd like to talk to you, if you're willing." She was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the yard and lifted a little of the dust and set it down again. "Half an hour," she said. Clara brought the coffee out, clearly delighted to be given the task. and disappeared back inside with the particular invisibility of a child who knows that adults sometimes need to be left alone and has decided to be useful about it. Amelia sat in the other chair. Colton held his cup with both hands and looked out at the yard for a while. She was comfortable with the silence. She had never had trouble with silence. It was something she had learned in her mother's kitchen, where speaking too much was considered a form of waste. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know you can tell me, it's none of my business." "All right," she said. "Why did you stay in Red Hollow?" He looked at her then. After what happened. You had every reason to leave." "Most women would have." She considered the question. It was a fair one, and it deserved a fair answer. "Because leaving would have meant I was letting you define the terms," she said. "You decided I wasn't what you were looking for. That was your right. But it wasn't your right to decide that I didn't belong here." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I belong wherever I decide to be. Red Hollow needed a cook. I needed work. The rest of it wasn't my problem to take on." He was quiet for a long moment. "I was wrong," he said, "about what I was looking for." I don't think he stopped again, and she waited. "I was measuring the wrong things. I've thought about that a great deal since." A pause. "Particularly in the last few days. You were sick," she said. "People think a great deal when they're sick. Half of it doesn't hold up once they're better." "This held up," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The morning stretched between them, warm and unhurried, and she felt something shift in a place inside her that she had locked up very carefully 2 years ago, when she had cried on the stage, back to Red Hollow, and then decided she was done with that particular kind of hope. She didn't say anything about what she felt. She was not ready to say it. And she was not certain enough that she had read him correctly. And she had made the mistake before of building on uncertain ground, and she was not going to make it again. "I'll check back on Thursday," she said. "After the bread." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'll be here," he said. She should have known that the town would have something to say about it. She had known in the abstract way she knew most things. She would rather not think about the way you know rain is coming, because the air smells different before you can see a single cloud. She had known and chosen to move forward anyway, because the alternative was letting Red Hollow make her smaller than she was. And she had promised herself, on the stage back from her first trip to the Hayes Ranch, that she would never allow that. The first comment came from Dora Hatch. Because it almost always came from Dora Hatch. It was the Thursday after Amelia's first visit to the ranch, and the diner was at its mid-morning slowdown, when Dora settled onto her usual stool with the air of a woman who has been waiting to say something since breakfast. "I heard you've been going out to the Hayes place," Dora said. "You heard correctly," Amelia said. She was slicing bread. She didn't look 1 week. "Medical visits," Amelia said. "His wound needed attending." "I'm sure it did." Dora's voice carried the particular lightness of someone approaching the real thing they want to say. Though there are those who wonder whether it's entirely proper. A single woman making repeated visits to a single man's home. "Those who wonder are welcome to wonder," Amelia said. "His sort doesn't settle for." Dora paused, with the precision of someone selecting the right tool. "For what's available, Amelia. He'll use whatever kindness you offer and then go looking for something more suitable when he's back on his feet. That's just the nature of it." Amelia set the knife down. She turned around. She looked at Dora Hatch with a steadiness that had taken years to build, and which she was not going to waste today. "Dora," she said, "I've been working in this diner for 2 years. I've heard everything this town has had to say about me. And I've made a point of not letting it cost me sleep, because it hasn't been worth it. But I want to be clear with you today." She picked the knife back up and turned back to the bread. "Whatever is or isn't happening at the Hayes Ranch is my concern and his. Not yours. Not anybody else's in this town. The next time you sit on that stool and begin a sentence with his sort, I'm going to ask you to finish your coffee somewhere else. Are we understood?" The diner was very quiet. Dora Hatch got off her stool and left without finishing her coffee. which Amelia considered a reasonable outcome. Pearl, from the kitchen doorway, said quietly, "Good for you. Give me 10 minutes, Amelia said. Then I'll need help with the afternoon order." What the town did not know, what nobody knew, except perhaps Clara, who noticed everything, was that the Thursday visits had become something else. They had started as medical. Amelia checked the wound, assessed the healing, advised on what to watch for. That part took 20 minutes at most, but somewhere in the second week, the 20 minutes had stretched, and the coffee had become part of it. And the coffee had led to conversation, and the conversation had turned out to be the thing she had not known she was hungry for. Colton Hayes, it emerged, had opinions. He was not, as the town believed, simply a large man who moved cattle from one place to another, and occasionally said something blunt. He had read everything he could get his hands on since boyhood histories. Mostly, and the newspapers that came through on the stage, which he read front to back and kept in a pile in his front room until the pile got big enough that Clara complained about it. He had thoughts about the railroad and about the way the land was being divided up and about what it was going to mean for the small ranchers in the county in 5 years' time. He had thoughts about Clara's schooling and whether the one-room school in Red Hollow was teaching her enough or whether she needed the tutor he'd been trying to talk himself into affording for the last year. He talked about these things the way a man talks who doesn't often have someone to talk to, with a kind of compressed intensity, like he was aware of the limited time and wanted to use it correctly. And he listened. That was the thing that surprised her most. He listened to her the way people rarely did, without waiting for her to stop speaking so he could add his own point. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered things she'd said the previous week. She had not been listened to like that in a long time. Possibly ever. "Clara says you taught her how to taste as she goes," he said. One Thursday in November, with the wind coming hard across the prairie and the warmth of the coffee doing serious work in her hands. "She mentioned it? She mentions a lot of things you've said." He looked at her steadily. "She talks about you more than she talks about most people. She's a bright girl," Amelia said. "She thinks carefully before she speaks, which is rarer than it ought to be. She gets that from somewhere I haven't figured out yet," he said. "Not from me. I'm blunt as a fence post, you're honest," Amelia said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment. "You're the first person who's made that distinction. Most people prefer comfortable over true," she said. "It's not a criticism of them, it's just how people are." "How are you?" he asked. "Comfortable or true?" She looked at him. "I think you already know the answer to that." "I think I do," he said. And then, quietly, "I think it's one of the things I like best about you." She looked away first. She looked out at the yard where the wind was pushing a trail of dust along the fence line. She looked away because she was not ready for what she felt when he said that, not ready to name it, or trust it, or build anything on it. She was, for the first time in a long time, afraid of something. Not of being hurt. She knew how to survive being hurt. She was afraid of wanting something this much and being wrong about it. "I should get back," she said. "You should," he agreed. He didn't try to stop her. She respected that too. She was saddling the roan when she heard boots on the packed earth behind her and turned to find a man she didn't know, heavy-set, well-dressed for the country, with the kind of soft hands that meant his work happened indoors. He was standing just inside the gate, and he was looking at her the way a person looks when they have decided to be unpleasant about something and are deciding which angle to approach from. "You're the woman from the diner," he said. "I am," she said. "Frank Alderman," he said. He said it like a name she should know. Which she didn't. "I have business with Hayes. Is he inside?" "He is," Amelia said. "You can knock." Alderman looked at her for a moment, with an expression she had learned to read quickly, the calculation of a man deciding how much he could get away with. "You've been spending considerable time out here," he said. "For a cook, medical visit." "Sure it is." He smiled. And it was the kind of smile that contained no warmth. "Friendly advice, miss. Colton Hayes is a man of property." Whatever you're imagining is going to come out of those visits, it won't. Men like him don't end up with women like you. You'd be saving yourself a good deal of embarrassment if you understood that now." Amelia finished buckling the cinch. She turned around and looked at Frank Alderman with the unhurried attention she gave everything. "I'll tell you something, Mr. Alderman," she said. "I have been hearing some version of that speech for 2 years from every corner of this county. And every time I hear it, the person saying it is a little more certain that they understand my situation better than I do, and a little less able to explain why my situation is any of their business." She gathered the reins. "I'll let Mr. Hayes know you're here." She walked past him without hurrying and went up the porch steps and knocked twice and said, When Colton came to the door, "There's a man at the gate. Alderman. Says he has business with you." Something happened in Colton's face, something she hadn't seen before. A tightening that was not pain. "How long has he been here?" "Just arrived," she said. "Did he say anything to you?" She met his eyes. Nothing worth repeating. Colton looked at her for a moment. Reading her the way she was learning, he read everything carefully, completely, without rushing the conclusion. Then he said, "Go out the side gate. I'll deal with him." "I'm perfectly capable of." "I know you are," he said. "Go out the side gate, Amelia, please." It was the please that did it. She was not accustomed to that word from a man who didn't give it easily. She went out the side gate. She heard the front gate open behind her, and Colton's voice low, measured, not friendly, saying, "Alderman." She didn't hear the rest. She rode toward Red Hollow with the wind at her back, and Alderman's words sitting in her chest like a stone she hadn't decided what to do with yet. "Men like him don't end up with women like you." She had heard it before. Softer sometimes, harder sometimes, but always the same essential sentence. She had built up a pretty good wall against it over the years. Brick by careful brick, and it held well against most things. Against Dora Hatch on her stool, against the eyes that followed her in church, against the particular silence that fell in a room when she walked into it. The pause that meant everyone had just been saying something they didn't want her to hear. It held against all of that. What it was less reliable against was the memory of Colton Hayes saying, "I think it's one of the things I like best about you," in the particular voice of a man who means what he says and does not say things he doesn't mean. She was halfway back to town before she realized she had not said goodbye to Clara. She resolved to bring her something from the kitchen on Thursday. She was already planning what it would be: the oatmeal cookies, perhaps, or the small apple tartlets she made when she had the time. She was already doing what she did when something threatened to overwhelm her, which was to think about something practical and useful and within her control. She thought about cookies. She thought about tartlets. She did not think about Frank Alderman, or what business he had at the Hayes Ranch, or why the name had made Colton's face do that thing it had done. She would think about that later. For now she had bread to start, and an afternoon order to fill, and the ordinary, daily, sustaining work of feeding people, who mostly didn't think about who had gotten up at 4 in the morning to make what was on their plates. She was good at that work. She had always been good at that work. And right now, in the particular rawness of the late November afternoon, she was very grateful to be good at something she could count on. Colton Hayes came into the diner that Thursday for the first time in 3 weeks. He came in the afternoon, not the morning, which was unusual enough that Pearl gave Amelia a look over the counter that Amelia deliberately did not acknowledge. He came in without his hat, which he had left on the post outside, and he stood in the doorway for a moment until his eyes found her behind the counter. "Mr. Hayes," Pearl said brightly, "can I get you something?" "I need a word with Miss Whitaker," he said. "If she can spare a few minutes." Pearl looked at Amelia. Amelia untied her apron and came out from behind the counter. She was aware, with the particular sensitivity that comes from years of practice, of exactly how many people in the diner were watching. The answer was all of them. The diner had gone quiet in the careful way of people who are still making noise but have stopped listening to it. They went to the far end of the porch, out of the main line of sight from the windows. It was cold. December was making itself felt early this year, and the wind off the mountains had an edge to it that would get sharper before it got better. Alderman came back, Colton said without preamble. He has a purchase offer on the ranch. He's been buying up property in the county 3 ranches south of here in the last year. He's got backing from somewhere. I haven't found out where yet. But the offers he's making are below value, and the men who've taken them have been in positions where they couldn't afford to refuse. Amelia looked at him. Is that what you came to tell me? No, he said. He looked at her steadily. I came to tell you that whatever he said to you at the gate, I want you to know it doesn't reflect anything that goes on in my head. She was quiet. I should have said it before you left, he said. I didn't because I wasn't sure you'd want to hear it. I'm still not sure, but I've been thinking about it for 3 days and I decided I'd rather say it wrong than not say it at all. The wind moved between them. She could hear the diner noise through the wall, the clatter of cups, the low sound of conversation, the ordinary music of a place where people gathered. Say it then, she said. He looked at her with that particular steadiness that she had come to understand was not coldness, was the opposite of coldness. In fact, was the way a man who had been burned very badly by loss held the things he valued now. With both hands and very carefully. I would like to keep seeing you, he said. Properly, not as a medical visit, as I don't know what the right word is. As something I'm choosing. A pause, if you're willing. She stood on that porch in the cold with the wind in her hair and the noise of the diner behind her and looked at Colton Hayes, who had been honest with her from the first moment and was being honest with her now. And she understood with a clarity that she had learned to trust that the wall she had built was not something she needed anymore, the way she had needed it before. She had built it to protect herself from this, from exactly this. And standing here, she understood that she had 2 choices, and that both of them were real, and that only one of them was true. Thursday mornings, she said. After the bread, he looked at her. Something moved in his face, not the careful blankness, not the assessing quiet, something open and tentative and so much more honest than either that she had to look away. Thursday mornings, he agreed. She went back inside. She tied her apron. She picked up where she'd left off and did not let her hands shake, which they wanted to. Pearl did not say a single word. Pearl simply refilled the nearest coffee cup and went about her business, which was the most useful and considerate thing she had done in a long time. Amelia thought Thursday, and underneath that quieter, like something she was only beginning to allow herself to put into words. He chose, not because she had saved him, not out of debt or gratitude or the particular guilt of a man who has been found wanting. He had looked at her, at all of her, the whole of her, without looking past anything or pretending anything away, and he had come to the diner on a Thursday afternoon in December and asked her, plainly and without decoration, if she was willing. She was, she realized, standing behind the counter of Pearl Dawson's diner on the coldest Thursday of the year, with bread rising in the back and the smell of coffee everywhere and the ordinary, daily fact of her life going on around her. She was willing. She had been willing for longer than she'd allowed herself to know. The Thursday mornings were the best part of her week. She would not have admitted that to anyone. She would barely admit it to herself. In the quiet of the back room before the diner opened, in the particular honesty that comes at 4 in the morning when the bread is rising and there is no one around to perform anything for. But it was true. The Thursday mornings had become the fixed point around which the rest of the week arranged itself. And she was aware of that, and she was aware of what it meant. And she had made a careful decision to let it mean it anyway. They had settled into a rhythm without discussing it. She brought the bread out at 7:30. He arrived at 8. Clara came sometimes, not always, but often enough that Amelia had started keeping the oatmeal cookies on a separate shelf. The ones Clara preferred, the ones with the dark sugar, and the hint of cinnamon that Clara had once described as tasting like winter mornings ought to taste. When Clara came, she sat between them and talked, and the three of them made a shape together at that counter that felt, to Amelia, like something she had not had a name for until she was standing inside it. When Clara didn't come, they talked alone. They had covered, over the course of those December mornings, a great deal of ground. His years in Wyoming before Montana, the woman he had loved and married and lost, he said her name plainly, without flinching, which told her he had made his peace with it, in the way that real grief eventually allows. The girl he had taken in afterward, who had arrived in his house with nothing, and had proceeded to rearrange everything in it, including him, the ranch and what it had cost him to build it, and what it would cost him to lose it. He talked about Alderman, sometimes not at length, not in a way that let worry take up more space than it deserved, but enough that she understood the situation was serious and was not going away. She talked, too, about her mother, who had been the best cook she'd ever known and who had died when Amelia was 17, leaving her with a medicine chest and a recipe book and a very clear understanding of what it meant to manage on very little. About Billings and the boarding house and the series of cooking jobs that had led her, eventually, to the newspaper advertisements and the letter and the stage to Red Hollow. She did not talk about the hurt of that first day, not because she was hiding it, but because it had become, in the particular alchemy of these Thursday mornings, something smaller than it had been, something that had happened, and mattered, and was no longer the whole story. He listened the way he always listened. She talked the way she always talked, plain and without decoration. What neither of them talked about was what this was, what it was becoming. There was an understanding between them that naming it too soon would be like pulling something green from the ground before it had finished growing. They both knew it. They both let it be. That was December. January changed things. Alderman made his second offer on the 14th of January. And this time he brought a lawyer. Amelia heard about it from Ed Briggs, who came into the diner that afternoon with the look of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has decided to put it down somewhere. He wants to meet, Ed said. He was at the counter, turning his coffee cup. Alderman. He's called a meeting at the courthouse, property owners in the county. Something about water rights. Colton's been asked to attend. Colton know yet? Amelia asked. He knows. Ed looked up. He also knows that 3 other ranchers have already agreed to sell. Smaller operations, but still. Alderman's been working them for months, apparently, offering just enough to make a man feel like he's choosing when he's really just being squeezed. What does he want with the land? Amelia asked. Railroad, Ed said. Or that's the rumor. There's a spur line coming through the territory in the next few years. And whoever owns the right corridor is going to make a great deal of money selling the right-of-way. Alderman's positioning himself to own that corridor. He paused. The Hayes Ranch sits right in the middle of it. Amelia was quiet for a moment. What does Colton want to do? Fight, Ed said. Which is what I expected. But fighting, it means having grounds. Means having records, documentation, knowing what he owns and what he can prove he owns. He looked at her steadily. I know this isn't your problem, Miss Whitaker. I just thought you'd want to know. She looked at him. You thought right, she said. Ed nodded. He finished his coffee. He put his hat back on and he paused at the door. And he said, without turning around, he's been different since November. Miss Whitaker. Different in a way that's good. In case that's something worth knowing. He left before she could respond. Which she suspected was intentional. She wrote out the next morning. Not Thursday, a Wednesday in the early afternoon. Without the bread and without any pretense that this was a medical visit. She tied the roan at the gate and went up to the porch and knocked, and Clara opened the door and looked at her with those serious eyes and said, He's in the front room. He's been at the papers since last night. He was, in fact, surrounded by papers, land surveys, deed records, correspondence, stacked and spread across the table in the deliberate chaos of a man who is trying to understand something that is being deliberately made difficult to understand. He looked up when she came in, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before. Not the careful quiet, not the tentative warmth of Thursday mornings. This was something raw and tired, and fighting to stay composed. "You heard," he said. "Ed came in yesterday," she said. She sat down across from him. "Show me what you have." He looked at her for a moment. "Amelia Colton," she said. "Show me what you have." He showed her. It took the better part of 3 hours. The land records were in order but incomplete. There were gaps in the survey documentation. Places where the original territorial records had been poorly transcribed. That a man like Alderman's lawyer could use to introduce doubt about boundary lines. The water rights were stronger, but depended on a series of agreements made 12 years ago with 2 neighboring ranchers, one of whom had since sold and one of whom was, apparently, at the courthouse meeting that had already been scheduled. "He's been building this for a long time," Amelia said. "At the end of it. At least 2 years," Colton said. "Maybe more." He sat back. He rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man who has been at something for a long time and is feeling the length of it. "The meeting is in 3 weeks. I've written to a land attorney in Helena. I don't know if he can get here in time." "What does the meeting decide?" Amelia asked. "Nothing legally. But Alderman will use it to establish community consensus. That he's offering fair prices, that the ranchers in the county support the development. He'll make it look like the holdouts are the problem." "Not him." Colton looked at her. "He's good at that. Making the person who won't go along look like the one being unreasonable." "I know the type," Amelia said. He looked at her with a slight, tired shift at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was the cousin of one. "I reckon you do. Who else is holding out?" she asked. He gave her 3 names. The Garrity family, who ran cattle on the south end of the county. Old Harlan Pruitt, who had been on his land since before the territory was organized, and who, by Ed's account, had told Alderman's man to get off his porch in language that had made the neighboring hens scatter. And a widow named May Sutton, who had inherited 60 acres from her husband and was trying to hold on to them for her 2 adult sons. "They need to talk to each other," Amelia said. Colton looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean Alderman is winning, because he's dealing with everyone separately. He goes to the Garrittys and tells them the other ranchers are already selling. He goes to Harlan Pruitt and tells him there's nothing to be done. He goes to Ma Sutton and tells her it's in her son's best interest." She leaned forward. "But none of them know what the others have been told. None of them know they're not alone." She looked at him. "If they talk to each other, Alderman loses that advantage." Colton was very still for a moment. Then he said, "You want to bring them together." "I want you to bring them together," she said. "You're the one they'll listen to. You're the one with the most to lose and the most standing in this county." She paused. "But yes, someone needs to put them in the same room." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind was picking up. She could hear it in the eaves. The particular sound of a Montana January, reminding everyone who was in charge. "That's going to make Alderman move faster," he said. "When he hears people are organizing, he'll accelerate. He might go back to the people who've already sold. Try to lock in agreements before anything can be contested." "Probably," she said. "But that works in your favor, too. If he moves too fast, he makes mistakes. Men who are used to operating quietly don't do their best work in a hurry." Colton looked at her with that steady, complete attention. "How do you know all this?" he said. It wasn't suspicious, it was genuinely curious. "My mother," she said. "She dealt with a man like Alderman once, when I was 12. A land agent who came through and tried to buy our property for a fraction of what it was worth. She organized every woman in the county whose husband had gotten the same offer. Stood up at the county meeting and read out every single lowball price that agent had offered. One after another while he sat there." She paused. "He left the county 2 days later. Colton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think your mother would have frightened me considerably." "She frightened everyone considerably," Amelia said. She considered it a professional obligation. This time the corner of his mouth did more than think about moving. It moved. The meeting happened on a Saturday, 2 weeks before the courthouse gathering, at the Hayes Ranch. Amelia made food not because anyone asked her to, but because a cold January morning was not the time to ask people to think clearly without something warm in their hands. And because she understood that comfort and trust were not separate things, and that the first one helped build the second. She made biscuits and beans and coffee enough for twice as many people as were coming. And she set it on the long table in the ranch's main room. And she went to stand in the kitchen doorway when the meeting started because it was Colton's meeting to run, and she was not going to crowd him out of it. The Garrity's came Tom and his wife Ruth, who had 5 children and who sat at the end of the table and did not miss a single word that was spoken. Old Harlan Pruitt came, smelling of horses and tobacco and 3 winters he should have stayed inside for, and sat with his arms crossed and the look of a man who has survived so many things that new problems do not impress him, but who is listening very carefully regardless. May Sutton came with her older son, a quiet young man named James, who had his mother's eyes and the look of someone who understood that this meeting was for her sake more than his, but was here because she shouldn't have to come alone. Ed Briggs was there, 2 of the ranch hands who had been with Colton long enough to have a stake in the outcome. And a woman Amelia hadn't expected, Reverend Morrison's wife. Helen, who had come, she said, because the Reverend was in bed with a chest cold, and she was not about to let that be a reason to stay home. Colton laid out what he knew. He was plain and careful about it, no exaggeration. No dramatics, just the facts as he understood them, and the gaps where he didn't yet have information. He told them what the railroad speculation meant, what aldermen stood to gain, and what each of them stood to lose. There was a long silence when he finished. Then Tom Garrity said, "He told us the Suttons had already agreed to sell." May Sutton sat up very straight. "He told us the Garritys had already agreed," she said. Another silence. "A different kind. He lied to both of you," Colton said. "He's been doing the same thing to everyone in this room. That's how he operates. He makes each person feel like they're the last one standing, like the decision's already been made and they're just choosing whether to be practical about it or difficult." He looked around the table. "Nobody in this room has agreed to anything. We are not the last one standing. We are standing together." Harlan Pruitt uncrossed his arms. He reached forward and took a biscuit. He bit into it, and he chewed it, and he said, "These are better than anything Haverford ever made." "That's Amelia," Clara said, from the corner where she had been so quiet that most people had forgotten she was there. Every head in the room turned toward the kitchen doorway. Amelia stood there with her arms at her sides, and the particular steadiness she carried into every room she'd ever been assessed in. "The biscuits are good," Ruth Garrity said. Her voice was warmer than her face, which was still making up its mind. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Amelia said. "There's more on the stove." Ruth Garrity looked at her for one more moment. Then she looked at Colton Hayes. Then she looked back at Amelia with the expression of a woman who has just understood something she's going to need a little time to absorb. But who has understood it? "We should talk about what happens at the courthouse meeting," Ruth said, turning back to the table. All of us together. The meeting went on for 2 more hours. Amelia kept the coffee hot. She listened from the kitchen doorway, and she stepped in twice once to answer a direct question about the water rights documentation, which she had read carefully enough the week before to have an opinion worth offering, and once to suggest quietly that May Sutton's situation was different from the others, in one important way that could actually be used to their advantage in a territorial court, if it came to that. May Sutton looked at her when she said it. "How do you know about territorial property law?" she asked. Genuinely curious. "I read everything I can find," Amelia said. "And my mother taught me to pay attention to the fine print." May Sutton nodded slowly. Your mother sounds like a smart woman, she said. She was, Amelia said. The smartest person I ever knew. Alderman found out about the meeting within 48 hours. Amelia had expected that. Small counties did not keep, and Alderman had clearly spent considerable time and money cultivating sources in Red Hollow. What she had not expected was how he would respond. He did not go to Colton. He went to her. He came into the diner on the Monday after the ranch meeting. Mid-morning, when the breakfast crowd had cleared and the lunch crowd hadn't arrived. He was alone this time, no lawyer, no companion, just Frank Alderman in his good coat. Sitting down at the counter with the deliberate ease of a man who has decided to try a different approach. Miss Whitaker, he said, I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee. The coffee here costs 10 cents, Amelia said. Same as for everyone else, he smiled. She noted that his smiles never reached his eyes. I heard there was a meeting at the Hayes Ranch Saturday, he said. I imagine you had something to do with that. I made biscuits, she said. Don't be coy, he said, and the pleasantness dropped about halfway out of his voice. Not all the way, he still needed something from her. And he knew it. You're a smart woman. I recognized that the first time I saw you. And I think you're smart enough to understand what's actually happening here. Tell me, she said. She poured his coffee. She set it in front of him. She was not going to give him the satisfaction of looking nervous. Hayes is fighting a losing battle, Alderman said. The railroad will come through this county, whether he agrees to it or not. The question is whether he benefits from it or gets dragged along behind it. The ranchers who sell now will get fair prices. The ones who wait will get what they're offered when the railroad company's patience runs out, which will be considerably less. He looked at her. You have influence with him. I think you know it. I'm asking you to use it. Amelia looked at him for a long, steady moment, Mr. Alderman, she said. I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. You're asking me to use my relationship with Colton Hayes to persuade him to accept an offer that's below the value of his land, so that you can profit from a railroad deal that you've been engineering for years without telling any of the people affected by it. Alderman's jaw tightened slightly. I'm asking you to be practical. I'm very practical, she said. Practical enough to recognize a man trying to use a woman to do something he can't manage himself. She picked up the coffee cup he hadn't touched and moved it to the end of the counter. Your coffee's getting cold, Mr. Alderman. I'd suggest you take it somewhere else. He stood up. The pleasantness was completely gone now, and what was underneath it was what she had suspected from the first, something harder and more deliberate. The expression of a man who has spent a long time getting what he wanted and is not comfortable with the sensation of not getting it. You're making a mistake, he said. I make my own mistakes, she said. That's the difference between you and me. Now get out of my diner. He left. Pearl came out from the back with both hands on her hips and said, Amelia Louise Whitaker. Don't, Amelia said. I'm just going to say one thing, Pearl said. Pearl. You were magnificent, Pearl said, and went back to the kitchen. She rode out to the ranch that afternoon. She didn't wait for Thursday. She had learned, in the month since December, that there were things worth not waiting for. Colton was in the yard when she arrived, working with one of the hands on a piece of fence equipment that had broken. And he straightened up when he heard the horse and looked at her with the particular attentiveness he had when something was wrong that he hadn't been told about yet. Alderman came to the diner, she said, without preamble. His face went very still. When, this morning? He wanted me to persuade you to take the offer. She dismounted. She tied the roan. She looked at him. I told him no and asked him to leave. The stillness in his face lasted a moment longer. Then he said, Are you all right? I'm fine, she said. He wasn't threatening. He was just confident. The kind of confident that comes from thinking he's the most important person in any room he enters. She paused. He knows about the meeting. He'll move faster now. Colton nodded. His jaw was working in the way it did when he was thinking through something carefully. I heard back from the attorney in Helena, he said. He can be here before the courthouse meeting. And I've been in contact with the Territorial Land Office. There are questions about Alderman's original survey filings that I think are worth raising." "That's good," she said. "Amelia." He said it quietly. She looked at him. "He came to you specifically. He knew you and I that there's something between us." He used it. Something moved in his expression. "I'm sorry that my situation put you in that position. Don't apologize for him," she said. "He made his own choices, I know," but he stopped. He looked at her with that complete, careful attention. "I need you to know that what you and I are, whatever this is that we're building, I have never wanted it to cost you anything. I've been watching what it costs you just to be in this county. Amelia, what you put up with every day from people who don't have a tenth of your worth and know it." She was quiet for a moment. The wind was cold and honest the way January wind always is. And she stood in it and felt the truth of what he was saying and let herself feel it without deflecting it. "It's cost me less than it used to," she said. "Since Thursday mornings." He looked at her. She looked back. Clara appeared in the doorway of the house behind him. Read the situation with her usual uncanny accuracy, and disappeared again without a word. Colton reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had done that, the first deliberate, unhurried physical gesture that was not a medical check or a functional necessity. His hand was large and work-roughened and very warm, and it held hers with a careful steadiness that matched everything else about him. "Whatever happens at that courthouse meeting," he said, "I want you there." She looked at him. "Are you sure?" "I've never been surer of anything since I decided to keep the ranch," he said. She turned her hand over in his and held it back. The courthouse meeting was scheduled for the first Friday in February. And in the 12 days between that conversation in the yard and the morning of the meeting, something shifted in Red Hollow, a slow, barely perceptible change in temperature. The way a room changes when someone has opened a window that had been stuck for a long time. It started with Ruth Garrity. Ruth Garrity came into the diner on the Wednesday before the meeting and sat at the counter, not Dora Hatch's stool. The one further down, the one that required you to have made a deliberate decision to sit somewhere, and ordered coffee and one of the oatmeal cookies and said, without looking directly at Amelia, "I wanted to thank you for Saturday. What you said about May Sutton's property was right, and it gave Tom something to work with." "I'm glad it helped," Amelia said. Ruth wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. She was a practical woman. Ruth Garrity not unfriendly, but not given to unnecessary sentiment. And she delivered what she had come to deliver, with the efficiency of someone who has talked herself into saying something difficult and is going to say it before she talks herself out again. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear it in the spirit it's meant." She looked up. "I was one of the people who talked about you when you first came here. About the Hayes business, I wasn't kind about it." Amelia held her gaze. "I'm saying so because I think it deserves to be said out loud," Ruth said. "Not just thought privately and left to rot." She took a sip of her coffee. "You didn't deserve it. What you did for him last summer, no. What you've done for this county, showing up to that meeting and knowing what you knew and not making any of us feel small for not knowing it, that was a thing worth doing. And I'm sorry I wasn't the kind of person before who would have recognized that." Amelia was quiet for a moment. She had prepared over 2 years for many kinds of things from many kinds of people. She had not particularly prepared for this. "Thank you," she said. "That took something to say." "Yes," Ruth said. "It did." She finished her coffee and stood up and picked up her coat. "My children are going to come in here on Saturday and buy bread. All 5 of them. I'm going to send them in one at a time so it's spread out and you don't have to deal with them all at once." She paused. "They've been told to be polite." She left. Amelia stood behind the counter for a moment. Pearl came out and stood beside her, and they both looked at the door where Ruth Garrity had been. "Well," Pearl said. "Well," Amelia agreed. She went back to work. But she carried that conversation with her through the rest of the day. The way you carry something that has shifted the weight of what you're holding without reducing it, still the same weight, but balanced differently, better. The night before the courthouse meeting, Amelia could not sleep. She lay in the narrow bed above the diner and listened to the building settle around her, the particular creak of old wood and cold air. The sound of the street below, which was quiet by 10 o'clock and stayed quiet until 4. She thought about the meeting. She thought about Alderman's lawyer, who was reportedly thorough and well prepared. She thought about what Colton had told her about the Territorial Land Office questions and whether the attorney from Helena would be able to raise them effectively. She thought about May Sutton and Harlan Pruitt and the Garrities, and whether the shape they had made together at that ranch table would hold under the pressure of a formal proceeding. And then, somewhere around midnight, she stopped thinking about all of that and thought about something smaller. She thought about the way Colton had held her hand in the yard. The careful steadiness of it. The way he had said, "I want you there," without hedging it, or softening it, or surrounding it, with the qualifications that people usually put around things they're not sure they're allowed to want. He had said it plainly. The way he said everything he meant. She got up at 2. She went downstairs and started the bread. Because the bread was always where she went when she needed to think without thinking. When she needed her hands to do something, while her mind worked through what it needed to work through. She mixed and folded and turned, and the kitchen filled with the smell of yeast and warm dough. And she thought about her mother and what her mother would have said about all of this. Her mother would have said, "You've been afraid of the wrong things. Amelia, you were never afraid of hard work, or being alone, or people thinking less of you than you deserved. You were afraid of being wanted, of someone choosing you and meaning it. Because if someone means it, then you have something to lose." Amelia pressed the heels of her hands into the dough. "You have something to lose," her mother would have said. That's not a warning. That's the point. The bread came out beautifully at 5:30. It always did when she was feeling something strongly, as though the emotion went into her hands, and from her hands into the dough, and from the dough into the oven, and came out the other side, transformed into something good and warm and nourishing. She was wrapping the first loaves when she heard a knock at the diner's back door. She opened it and found Clara Hayes on the step, bundled in her coat with her braids coming loose and her serious face set with the particular resolution of a child who has done something she knows requires an explanation. "Clara," Amelia said, "it's 5:30 in the morning." "I know," Clara said. "I rode in by myself." She paused. "Don't tell Colton until after." "After what?" Clara reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it out. "I found this last night," she said. "In Alderman's lawyer's coat. He left it in the church entry when he came to talk to Reverend Morrison last week. And I picked it up because I thought it was a piece of trash someone had dropped." Amelia took the paper. She unfolded it. She read it once, then again. Her heart went very still and then began to beat very fast. It was a letter. Between Alderman and a name she didn't recognize, a name followed by a title. Deputy Registrar, Territorial Land Office, Helena. And the content of it made the hair on the back of her neck rise. Because it was not about railroad speculation or property purchases or anything as straightforward as any of that. It was about the survey records, the gaps in the survey documentation that Colton had shown her, the places where the records were poorly transcribed and the boundary lines were uncertain. The letter made clear, in language that was careful enough to avoid being explicit, but plain enough to anyone who understood what they were reading, that those gaps had not been accidental. They had been made. Someone inside the Territorial Land Office had altered the original records. Introduced just enough uncertainty that a legal challenge to the boundary lines would be difficult to win and would be decided by the same office that had altered the records. Alderman had not just been buying land cheaply. He had been manufacturing the conditions under which the land had to be sold. Amelia looked up at Clara. Clara was watching her with the steady, Serious eyes of a child who knew what she had found without knowing all of what it meant. "You read it?" asked. "Enough of it," Clara said. "Is it bad?" "It's very bad for aldermen," Amelia said. "Which makes it very good for us." She folded the paper carefully and put it in her apron pocket. She looked at Clara. "Come inside. I'm going to get you warm and fed. And then we're going to figure out how to get this to Colton before the meeting starts." Clara stepped inside. She looked at the bread cooling on the rack and said, "Is that the sourdough?" "It is," Amelia said. "Good," Clara said. "I was hoping it would be." Amelia put her hand briefly on the girl's shoulder just a moment. Just enough to say what she didn't have words for yet, and then she went to cut the bread. She sent Clara back to the ranch with Ed Briggs, who arrived at the diner at 6:15 with the expression of a man who had woken up, discovered a child missing, and aged 5 years in the space of finding out where she had gone. "She's safe," Amelia said before he could speak. "She brought me something important. I'll explain when there's time. Get her home, get her warm, and tell Colton I need to see him before the meeting." "Before the meeting starts, Ed, not after." Ed looked at Clara, who was finishing her second piece of bread with the unrepentant composure of someone who has done a difficult thing and stands behind it. He looked at Amelia. He put his hat back on. "I'll tell him," he said. "Tell him it's urgent," Amelia said. "Tell him I find it," Ed said. "Or did you?" "Clara found it," Amelia said. "I know what it means." Ed looked at the girl one more time with an expression that had started as exasperation and was working its way, reluctantly, toward something closer to pride. "Come on." "Then," he said, "before the whole county knows you're here." Clara slid off the stool. She pulled her coat straight. She looked at Amelia with those serious eyes and said, "Was it enough?" "It's enough," Amelia said. "You did something very brave." "Your father is going to be," she paused. "He's going to want to scold you and thank you at the same time. Try to let him do both." Clara almost smiled. It was the Hayes version of a smile brief. Genuine, and gone before most people would have caught it. Then she followed Ed out the back door, and Amelia heard the horses, and then the sound of hooves on frozen ground, and then nothing. She stood in the kitchen with the letter in her apron pocket and her hands pressed flat on the counter and her mind moving very fast through everything she had read and everything it meant and what needed to happen before 9 o'clock that morning. She needed the attorney from Helena. His name was Garrett, and he had arrived 2 days ago and was staying at the boarding house on the far end of Main Street. She needed him to read the letter before the meeting and understand its implications because she had read it 3 times herself and was confident in her interpretation. But she was not a lawyer, and the meeting would need a lawyer to make it count. She needed Colton. She needed about 4 more hours in the day than she currently had. She untied her apron, put on her coat, and went to wake up a lawyer. Marcus Garrett was not pleased to be knocked on at 6:30 in the morning. He answered the boarding house door in his shirt sleeves, with his hair not yet combed and the expression of a man interrupted mid-thought, which she suspected was his usual expression regardless of the time. He was younger than she'd expected, early 30s. Lean, with the quick, precise eyes of someone who read everything and forgot very little. He looked at her standing on the boarding house step in the cold and said, "You're the woman from the diner." "I am," she said. "My name is Amelia Whitaker. I have a letter you need to read before 9 o'clock. He looked at her for one assessing moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "I'll get my coat." She gave him the letter. She stood beside the window and watched him read it, watched his eyes move across the page, watched the slight shift in his posture as he reached the relevant section, watched him go back and read it again more slowly. "Where did this come from?" he said. "It was in the possession of Alderman's lawyer," she said. "I'd rather not say more about how it came to me." Garrett looked at her over the paper. "I'm going to need to know eventually." "Eventually," she agreed. "Not this morning." He looked back at the letter. "The name here, Whitfield, Deputy Registrar. I know this office. I've dealt with this office. If this is authentic." He stopped. He set the letter down with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands he is handling something significant. If this is authentic, Alderman hasn't just been buying land. He's been colluding with a territorial official to manufacture a legal environment that forces the sales. That's not civil fraud, that's criminal. Yes, Amelia said. That's what I thought it was. This changes the entire nature of the meeting this morning, Garrett said. If I can introduce this. Can you, she said. It depends on whether Alderman's lawyer challenges the provenance, Garrett said. If he can establish that the letter was taken without authorization, he paused. He looked at her again. How confident are you in how it was obtained? Completely confident that no crime was committed, she said carefully. The letter was found in a common area. It was not taken from a person or a locked space. Garrett held her gaze for a long moment. He was a man, she thought, who was very good at distinguishing between what a client was saying and what a client needed him to understand. All right, he said. He picked up the letter again. Then I think we have a very interesting morning ahead of us. Colton arrived at the diner at 7:45. He came through the back door the way he always came, when he didn't want to make a production of it. And he found her behind the counter with her coat still on and her hands around a coffee cup she hadn't drunk from in 20 minutes. He looked at her face. He did not ask if she was all right. Which she appreciated, because the question would have taken time they didn't have, and the answer was complicated. He said, Ed told me, where is it? I gave it to Garrett, she said. He's been working with it for an hour. He thinks it's enough. Enough for what? Exactly. To change the nature of the proceeding this morning, she said. Alderman has a man inside the Territorial Land Office. Colton, the gaps in your survey documentation, they weren't errors. They were put there deliberately. Alderman manufactured the legal uncertainty that makes your land title look weaker than it is. That's why no matter what documentation you produced, it was always going to have holes in it. The holes were the point. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man absorbing something that confirms a fear he has been carrying without being able to name it. How long has he been doing this? Colton said. The letter references arrangements going back at least 3 years, she said. Possibly longer. He's been building this for a long time. Colton's jaw was working. She could see the anger in him, not the explosive kind, but the worst kind, the cold, deliberate kind that comes from a man who has been careful and patient and diligent, and that someone else has been undermining that care from the inside. The Garretts, he said. May Sutton. Their documentation, probably all have similar problems, she said. That's what you need Garrett to establish this morning. Not just your case, all of them. He stood there for a moment with his hands on the counter and his head slightly down, and she could see him moving through it, the anger, the calculation, the settling into what needed to happen now. She had seen him do this before. It was one of the things she respected most about him. The ability to feel something completely and then set it aside in favor of what was required. He looked up. Come with me, he said. To the meeting. Sit at the table, not in the back. She looked at him. Colton, you found this, he said. You brought Garrett into it. You organized the meeting at the ranch. You understood what Alderman was doing before any of the rest of us did. He looked at her with complete steadiness. This is as much your fight as mine. I want you at the table. She thought about what Alderman had said in the diner. His sort doesn't end up with women like you. She thought about Dora Hatch on her stool. She thought about 2 years of being the woman at the edge of every room. Present but not included. Useful but not acknowledged. All right, she said. All right, he said. He reached out and straightened the collar of her coat, a gesture so quiet and natural that it took her a breath to register it. Then he picked up his hat and said, We should go. Garrett's waiting. She followed him out into the February morning. And for the first time in 2 years in Red Hollow, she walked down the main street of that town beside someone who had chosen to put her there. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. This was not, Amelia understood, A coincidence. Alderman had done his work, had made sure that the meeting felt like a community event. Like something the whole county had a stake in, because a full room was a room where public opinion could be shaped, and where a man who was very good at appearing reasonable had the most advantage. She scanned the faces as they came in. Tom and Ruth Garrity near the front. Harlan Pruitt beside them, arms crossed, looking like a geological feature that had developed an opinion. May Sutton with James beside her, their hands not touching but close. And in the row behind them, faces she recognized from the diner people who came in every week. Who she fed, who she had cooked for in the particular anonymity of being the person behind the counter. They looked at her now with a different kind of attention. Dora Hatch was there. Of course she was. And Margaret Collins, the woman who had walked into Colton's kitchen the morning after the fever broke, with her straight back and her assessment of where people belonged, sat 2 rows back in a green wool dress, watching the room with the focused attention of someone who has come to watch something they expect will confirm what they already believe. Alderman was at the front table with his lawyer, a man named Prescott who had the careful effectlessness of someone trained to never let a room read him. Alderman looked, when Colton came in, like a man who has been expecting something and has decided to be unconcerned about it. He looked when he saw Amelia walking beside Colton, like a man recalibrating. It was the recalibration that told her they were right. A man with nothing to fear does not recalibrate. Marcus Garrett was already seated at the table set aside for the ranchers. He had the letter, or rather a careful legal copy he had made that morning, with the original in his breast pocket, and he had the look of a man who has been given something to work with and fully intends to work with it. County Commissioner Earl Hawkins called the meeting to order at 9 o'clock. Hawkins was a careful, methodical man who had held the commissioner's position for 12 years by the simple strategy of being the least objectionable person in any negotiation. And he opened the proceedings with the standard language of public interest and fair process, which Amelia listened to while watching Alderman's face. Alderman spoke first. He was good at it, she had to give him that. He was measured and reasonable sounding, and he made the railroad development sound like something being offered to the county, rather than extracted from it. He talked about prosperity and progress, and the benefit to families who could realize the value of their land and reinvest elsewhere. He had maps. He had projected figures. He had the practiced polish of a man who had delivered this presentation in several counties and knew which parts made people nod. The ranchers listened. They did not nod. When Alderman finished, Prescott laid out the property assessments, the valuations that Alderman was offering, which were, as Ed had said, just enough to make a man feel like he was choosing rather than being robbed. Then Garrett stood up. He was quiet about it. He didn't make a production of rising from his chair. He simply stood and waited for Hawkins to acknowledge him, and said, "Commissioner, I represent several of the landowners in this county. I have some concerns about the documentation underlying these assessments that I'd like to raise before we go any further." Prescott looked at Garrett the way a chess player looks at an opponent who has made an unexpected move. The assessments were prepared in accordance with Territorial Land Office records, he said. If there are specific line items in dispute, it's not the line items, Garrett said. It's the records themselves. He opened his case and laid papers on the table. Over the past several days, I've had the opportunity to review the original survey documentation for the Hayes Ranch and several neighboring properties. I've found significant discrepancies between those original records and the versions currently held in the Territorial Land Office. Discrepancies that, in my professional opinion, are not the result of transcription error. The room was very quiet. "What are you suggesting?" Hawkins said. "I'm suggesting," Garrett said, "that the records were altered." He paused. "And I have documentation that indicates who altered them and who commissioned the alteration." Prescott was on his feet. "Commissioner, this is a serious allegation without foundation." "The foundation," Garrett said, "is a letter of correspondence between Mr. Frank Alderman and one Thomas Whitfield. currently serving as Deputy Registrar of the Territorial Land Office in Helena, discussing the specific modifications to be made and the payment to be received for those modifications. He set the copy on the table. I'll be submitting the original to the Federal Marshal's office this afternoon. The room did not just go quiet. It went the particular kind of quiet that happens when a large number of people are each simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they understood about a situation. Amelia watched Alderman's face. She had expected many things from that face: anger, denial, the controlled performance of outrage. What she had not expected was the thing that moved across it first, before he had time to replace it with something more useful. What moved across it first was the expression of a man who has been told that something he believed was secure has given way. It lasted less than a second. Then the performance replaced it: the controlled face, the reasonable voice, the pivot to challenging the provenance of the letter. But she had seen it, and from the way Ruth Garrity leaned over and said something quiet to Tom, and from the way Tom nodded slowly and didn't look away from Alderman's face, she thought Ruth had seen it too. What followed was not a simple thing. She had not expected it to be. Prescott challenged the letter's admissibility. Garrett countered with the precise legal argument he had clearly been preparing since 6:30 that morning. Commissioner Hawkins called a recess twice, and the room buzzed with the particular sound of people revising their understanding of a situation they had thought was settled. During the first recess, Harlan Pruitt stood up and walked directly to Colton and said, loudly enough that the nearest 2 rows could hear him, "I knew something was wrong with those surveys. 40 years I've been on that land and the lines don't move. But they told me the lines had always been that way." He shook his head. "Should have trusted my own memory." "You couldn't have known," Colton said. "No," Harlan said, "but I should have asked more questions." He looked at Amelia, standing slightly behind Colton's shoulder. "She the one who found it?" "She is," Colton said. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. He had the weathered, direct face of a man who has lived outdoors for most of his life and sees no reason to soften anything he's thinking. "Good," he said. "Pay attention to that." Hayes. He walked back to his seat without waiting for a response. Colton did not look at Amelia, but she saw the back of his neck go slightly warm under his collar, and she decided that was sufficient. During the second recess, Margaret Collins crossed the room. Amelia saw her coming and did not move. She had learned not to move toward things that were coming for her, and not to move away from them either. She stood and waited, with the coffee she had gotten from the side table and hadn't drunk going cold in her hand. Margaret Collins stopped in front of her. She was impeccably dressed, and her posture was still the kind that communicated something about hierarchy. But her face had, underneath the composure, the look of a woman who has made a decision that cost her something. "I owe you an apology," Margaret Collins said. Amelia looked at her. "I said something at the summer social last year," Margaret said, "about people knowing their place." Her chin was up and her voice was steady, but the steadiness had effort in it. "I was referring to you. I think everyone in that room knew it." "They did," Amelia said. "I was wrong." She said it plainly. "Not just about I was wrong about all of it. What you did for Colton last summer. What you've done this morning." She paused. "You're not what I thought you were." "What did you think I was?" Amelia asked. She was not hostile. She was genuinely curious about what people like Margaret Collins saw when they looked at a woman like her. Margaret looked at her for a moment. "Small," she said. "I thought you were small." A pause. "You're not." Amelia held the woman's gaze. She thought about 2 years of being the punchline in this town. She thought about the stage from Billings and the newspaper advertisement, and the man who had looked at her in his yard and said, "You didn't look like the woman I imagined." She thought about 4 in the morning and bread rising, and the long discipline of building something good from very little and never letting anyone see how much it had cost. "I know," she said. "I've always known." Something shifted in Margaret Collins's face. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose you have. She walked back to her seat. She sat down. She did not look like a woman who had gotten what she came for. But she looked, Amelia thought, like a woman who had said something true and was finding out what that felt like. The second half of the meeting was where things broke. Garrett had used the recess to prepare something additional. She wasn't sure how he had managed it in the time available. But lawyers of a certain caliber seemed to function on a different relationship with time than ordinary people. He had, in the course of the morning, connected with James Sutton by note. And James had confirmed something she hadn't known. That when May Sutton's husband had died, the property had been partially resurveyed. And that the resurvey had happened at Alderman's request. Framed at the time as a courtesy, the resurvey Garrett established with careful, methodical precision was where the first alteration had been introduced into the Sutton property records. May Sutton, when she understood what she was hearing, sat very still for a moment. Then she said in a voice that carried clearly through the room, because it was quiet and precise and meant to carry. He told me it was to help clarify the estate. He told me it would make things easier for my sons. The room heard that. The room absorbed it. Prescott made 3 more attempts to redirect the proceedings back to the original agenda. Hawkins, who had started the morning as a man trying to manage competing interests and had become, over the course of 2 hours, a man who understood that he was sitting at the center of something considerably than a property dispute, shut each attempt down with increasing firmness. Alderman himself said nothing after Garrett produced the letter. He had a composed, watchful silence that Amelia recognized as the silence of a man recalculating in real time, assessing what he could salvage, what he could deny, what the exposure was and where it was coming from. His eyes found her once across the room. She held the look without moving. He looked away first. When Commissioner Hawkins finally called the formal conclusion of the meeting, declaring that all property transactions under discussion were suspended pending investigation by the Territorial Attorney General's office, and that a full audit of the Land Office records was being requested immediately, the room broke into sound. Not celebration, exactly. Too many of these people were too worried about what the investigation would mean for their own documentation. Too uncertain about what happened next for it to be celebration. But something released in that room, some pressure that had been building since Alderman had started making his rounds through the county. The pressure of people who know something is wrong, but can't prove it and can't afford to fight it. That released. Tom Garrity shook Garrett's hand. Harlan Pruitt stood and walked out without ceremony, which was, Amelia suspected, his version of a standing ovation. May Sutton sat very still for a long moment with her hands folded in her lap. And then she looked at Amelia across the room with an expression that said everything that needed to be said without requiring words. Colton was talking to Hawkins, the two of them, standing slightly apart from the rest. Their heads together, Hawkins making notes on a paper he'd produced from somewhere. Amelia watched him from where she stood and thought about all the things she had come to know about this man over the course of one terrible, cold, transformative Montana winter. The way he listened, the way he was angry about the right things and controlled about the way he expressed it, the way he had walked into the diner on a December Thursday and asked her, plainly and without decoration, if she was willing. She was thinking about this when Dora Hatch appeared beside her. She had not seen Dora cross the room. She was simply there. Suddenly, with her coat on, and her hat in her hands, and her face carrying something she was clearly working up to. I heard what Garrett said, Dora said. About how it was found, did you? Amelia said. He said a miner found a letter in a public area. A child. A girl. Dora's hands moved on her hat. Was it Clara? Amelia said nothing. She couldn't have known what she was picking up, Dora said. But someone had to know what to do with it once she had it. She looked at Amelia with an expression that was not quite respect and not quite apology, but was something that lived in the neighborhood of both. That was you. Clara is a very observant child, Amelia said. Yes, Dora said. A pause. She has good examples. Amelia looked at her. Dora Hatch had sat on that stool every morning for 2 years and offered commentary that had cost Amelia sleep and dignity, and the kind of peace that comes from feeling like you belong somewhere. She had done it casually, without malice, which was almost worse, because it meant she had never considered whether it cost Amelia anything at all. Dora was considering it now. Amelia could see the consideration in her face, uncomfortable and overdue and genuine. "All right," Amelia said. It was not absolution and it was not dismissal. It was just all right. We are here now in this moment. And this is what we have to work with. Dora nodded. She put her hat on. She left. The crowd had thinned considerably by the time Colton finished with Hawkins and found her standing near the door. He came across the room with the deliberate stride of a man who knows where he's going. And he stopped in front of her, and he looked at her the way he looked at things he was certain about. "Hawkins is sending a wire to Helena this afternoon," he said. "Garrett is going with him to make sure the letter is properly filed. They'll have a federal marshal here within the week." "Good," she said. "The property transactions are all frozen," he said. "Nobody sells anything until the audit is done. That buys time, maybe enough time to establish titles for everyone Alderman targeted." He paused. "This isn't over. The investigation will take months. Prescott will fight it." "I know," she said. "But we won this morning," he said. "Because of that letter." He looked at her steadily. "Because of you. Because of Clara," she said. "Because of both of you," he said. He held her gaze. "I want you to know what this means to me. The ranch, it's not just property. It's where Clara grew up. It's what I have left of." He stopped. He started again. "It's what I built when I didn't have anything else to build. And he was going to take it by making me feel like the fight wasn't worth having." "You would have fought anyway," she said. "Maybe," he said. "But I would have lost." He held her gaze. "I don't think I'm going to lose now." She held his gaze back and felt, somewhere under the exhaustion and the cold and the long, complex morning, something that was very simple and very clear. The door of the courthouse opened behind them. People moved past. The February wind came in with each opening. Sharp and honest. "There's something I need to ask you," Colton said. His voice was quiet enough that it was just for her. Just in this space between them, not for the room. "And I want you to know that whatever your answer is, nothing changes. What we've built." He stopped himself. "Started again. I'm not good at this." "You're doing fine," she said. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved, and this time it was not brief and it was not gone before she could see it. "Amelia," he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me. Not today, not before you've had time to think about what that means and whether it's what you want. But I would like you to know that it's what I want. That I have been certain about it for longer than I've known how to say it." The courthouse emptied slowly around them. Outside, Red Hollow was going about the business of a February morning, the sounds of it familiar and ordinary and entirely indifferent to the fact that something was shifting. Irrevocably, in the space between these two people standing near the door. Amelia thought about the newspaper advertisement folded soft as cloth in her memory. About the first day and the yard and the man who had said, "You didn't look like the woman I imagined." About the stage back to Red Hollow and the decision she had made in the particular dignity of a woman who had decided she could not let someone else's failure of imagination become her limitation. She thought about Thursday mornings, about bread, about a child who had ridden alone in the dark to put the right thing in the right hands. She thought about her mother, who would have taken one look at Colton Hayes and said, "Well, Amelia, it took long enough. I need to think about it," she said. He nodded. He had expected that. She had known he would expect it. Because he was a man who understood that a real answer required time, and that asking for time was not a rejection. "I know," he said. "But," she looked at him. "Ask me again on Thursday." Something moved in his face, open and careful, and more honest than anything she had seen there yet. "Thursday," he said. "I'll be there at 8. "I know," she said. "You always are." She pulled her coat closed and walked out of the courthouse into the February cold. And the town of Red Hollow opened up around her, the diner on the left, the general store on the right, the boarding house at the end of the street. And people she recognized in every direction, people who had watched her for 2 years and were now watching her differently. With a different kind of attention, the kind that comes after a room has been very quiet in a way that changes things. She walked down the middle of the street. She did not hug the edges. She did not look at the ground. She walked straight down the middle of Main Street in Red Hollow, Montana, in the February of 1887, with the cold air on her face, and the letter safe in Garrett's pocket, and the sound of the town around her. And she held her head the way a woman holds her head when she has fully stopped apologizing for the space she takes up. Ruth Garrity, standing outside the general store, saw her coming and raised one hand in a small, deliberate acknowledgement. Amelia raised hers back. She kept walking. Thursday came the way all important days come ordinary on the outside, with the same cold air and the same gray pre-dawn dark and the same smell of yeast and flour that had defined every morning of her life in Red Hollow for 2 years. Amelia was up at 4. She started the bread. She worked in the particular quiet of a woman who has something large living in her chest and has decided to let it live there without poking at it until she is ready. She had spent 4 days thinking. She had thought about it while she worked and while she slept, and during the long Tuesday afternoon when Pearl had sent her home early because she had burned the same batch of biscuits twice, and Pearl, who was a practical woman, had recognized that a person burning things twice in a row is a person who needs to go somewhere and think without an oven involved. She had sat in the narrow room above the diner with her mother's recipe book in her lap, and she had thought about everything about what marriage meant, and what it cost, and what she was bringing into it, and what she was being offered. She had thought about the word home, what it meant to her. Specifically, she had not had one since her mother died when she was 17. She had had rooms, the boarding house in Billings, the room above the diner, the succession of temporary spaces that a woman accumulates when she is moving through the world without a fixed point. She had made each of them as livable as possible, because that was what she did with everything. She worked with what she had, and she made it good. But they were not home. She had thought about Clara, who had ridden alone in the dark to put the right thing in the right hands. Who had said I asked him about why he kept coming back for the bread. Who had described oatmeal cookies as tasting like winter mornings ought to taste. Which was the kind of thing a child says when she is grown up in a house where no one had ever thought to make her that particular thing before. She had thought about Colton, not the fever night version, not the courthouse version, not the Thursday morning version. All of them. The man who had been honest with her when honesty was the harder thing. The man who had held her hand in the yard and asked if she was willing. The man who had said, "I want you at the table," not as a courtesy but as a statement of belief. The kind of belief that does not hedge or qualify. By Wednesday evening she knew her answer. She had probably known it since he asked. But she had given herself the 4 days anyway, because it was her answer to give, and she was going to give it on her own terms, and in her own time. And that was, she had decided, the only way to begin. He arrived at 8. She had known he would. He came through the diner door with his hat in his hands and his coat still cold from the outside air. And the diner was not empty. Pearl was behind the counter, and 2 ranch hands she didn't know were at the far table with their coffee. But Colton Hayes walked to the counter and stood in front of her and looked at her the way he had looked at her that very first Thursday after he'd come in and asked properly. The look that had no performance in it. "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed. She came out from behind the counter. She did not ask Pearl if she could step away, and Pearl did not offer an opinion. Because Pearl was a smart woman and could read a room as well as anyone in the county. Amelia and Colton went to the far end of the porch, outside, where the cold air was clean, and there was no one to perform anything for. He stood. The street was quiet at this hour. Mostly a wagon going past, a dog somewhere, the ordinary sounds of a town before it had fully decided to be awake. "I've thought about it," she said. "I know," he said. 4 days. "Yes," she said. She looked at him. "I'm going to say yes, but I need to tell you why." "Because I think the why matters." He was very still. "Tell me," he said. "I'm not saying yes because you saved me," she said. "You didn't. I saved myself when I got off that stage and decided to stay. I'm not saying yes because I'm grateful or because it's practical or because I've run out of other options." She held his gaze. "I'm saying yes because you are the first person in my adult life who looked at all of me, not the useful parts. Not the parts that were easy to be around all of me. And decided to come back every Thursday. And not just for the bread." Something moved in his face that she didn't have a word for. Something that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but was the specific expression of a man who has been carrying a held breath for a long time and has finally been told he can let it go. "Amelia," he said. "And because Clara needs someone to teach her to taste as she goes," she said. "And nobody in that ranch house knows what to do with proper biscuits." The corner of his mouth moved. "The full version, the one that stayed." "That's true," he said. "So yes," she said, "when you're ready. On your terms and mine. And we'll figure out the rest as we go." He reached out and took her hand the way he had taken it in the yard, careful and warm and certain, and he held it and said, "I've been ready since December. I was waiting for you to be ready." "I know," she said. "That's one of the reasons. The town found out the way towns always find out, not from an announcement. Not from anything either of them said publicly, but from the particular arithmetic of people watching a man and a woman and understanding from the way they move around each other that something has been decided." Pearl knew by 8:15, Ruth Garrity knew by 9. By the time Amelia opened the diner at 10, Dora Hatch was on her stool with the air of a woman who has already processed a significant piece of information and is deciding what to do with it. Amelia set a cup of coffee in front of her without being asked. Dora looked at it. She looked at Amelia. "Is it true?" she said. "Is what true?" Amelia said. "Pearl should focus on her own business," Amelia said. Pleasantly. Dora was quiet for a moment. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "He's a good man," she said finally. "Colton Hayes. He's a hard man and a quiet man, but he's a good one." She paused. "I should have said that a long time ago instead of the things I did say." "Yes," Amelia said. "You should have." "I'm saying it now," Dora said. "I hear you," Amelia said. It was not a warm conversation. It was not meant to be. But it was honest, and Amelia had always found that honesty, even the uncomfortable kind, was better than the alternative. She refilled Dora's coffee and moved down the counter. And she felt, as she moved, that the weight she had been carrying in this town had shifted again, not disappeared. Not transformed into something easy, but redistributed in a way that let her stand differently under it. The federal marshal arrived the following week. On a Wednesday, with 2 deputies and a letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office that made Commissioner Hawkins go pale in a way that suggested he was reconsidering several of his recent decisions. The investigation into Alderman and Thomas Whitfield at the Territorial Land Office opened formally within 48 hours. And Prescott, Alderman's lawyer, was seen at the stage depot the morning after that, with 2 heavy expression of a man who has decided that his professional obligations end precisely where his personal exposure begins. Alderman himself was not arrested that week. The investigation was slow and thorough, which Garrett had warned them it would be. But his purchase agreements were all suspended. His influence in the county evaporated with the speed that influence always evaporates when the thing supporting it is revealed. And the land office in Helena began the long, careful process of auditing every record that Whitfield had touched in the past 4 years. Garrett stopped by the diner before he rode back to Helena. He sat at the counter and drank a cup of coffee and ate 2 oatmeal cookies and said, with the matter-of-fact precision that was his natural register, "The Garrity property and the Hayes property have the strongest cases for record restoration. May Sutton's will take longer because the original survey predates the territorial records system, and there's some legitimate ambiguity that has to be untangled from the manufactured ambiguity. But she'll get there. You did good work, Miss Whitaker. Clara did good work, Amelia said. Clara is 9 years old, Garrett said. She picked up a piece of paper. You knew what to do with it at 6:30 in the morning, before you'd had a full cup of coffee. He picked up his third cookie. These are exceptional, by the way. Dark sugar and cinnamon, Amelia said. You have to let the butter brown before you add it in. I'll pass that along to no one, Garrett said. Because I don't cook, but I appreciate it. He left on the noon stage, and Amelia watched him go with the particular gratitude she felt for people who do their jobs well and do not make a production of it. The twist she had not seen coming arrived on a Thursday. Of course it did. It was March by then, 6 weeks after the courthouse meeting. And the investigation had become a background fact of county life, the way large ongoing things become important. Present, talked about, but no longer the consuming center of every conversation. Life had moved back to its rhythms. The diner was full. The bread sold. The Thursday mornings continued, and they were different now, not different in their warmth or their ease, but different in the particular quality of certainty that comes when something has been named. She and Colton talked about practical things, the ranch, Clara's schooling, the tutor he had finally committed to, a young woman from Billings who would come 3 days a week and who Clara had, after an initial period of formal assessment, declared acceptable. The wedding, which they had agreed, would be small and in the spring and conducted by Reverend Morrison, who had taken the entire situation in stride with the equanimity of a man who has seen most things that believe God is not particularly surprised by any of them. She was behind the counter at 10 in the morning when the door opened and a woman walked in that she did not recognize. The woman was about 50, well-dressed, in the way of someone who has traveled a long distance in good clothes and is still wearing them with composure. She had dark hair going silver and the kind of face that had been beautiful in a conventional way 20 years ago and had aged into something more interesting. She looked around the diner with the alert, assessing attention of someone who is looking for something specific. Her eyes landed on Amelia. She walked to the counter. She sat down. She folded her hands on the countertop and said, "Are you Amelia Whitaker?" said. "My name is Helen Foss," the woman said. "I'm Colton Hayes' sister." Amelia went very still on the inside. On the outside, she said calmly, "Can I get you some coffee?" Mrs. Helen said. Amelia poured it. She set it down. She looked at Helen Foss, who was looking at her with an expression that was hard to read, not hostile, not warm, carefully neutral, in the way that people are neutral when they are reserving judgment and want you to know they are reserving it. "He wrote to me," Helen said, 2 weeks ago. "He told me he was getting married." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "Colton doesn't write letters unless something significant is happening. Last time he wrote to tell me about Clara." She paused. "I came because I wanted to meet you before the wedding. He didn't tell me you were coming," Amelia said. "I didn't tell him I was," Helen said. "I wanted to see you without. I wanted to see you as you are. Not as he sees you." She looked at Amelia directly. "My brother has been alone for a very long time, since his wife died. He closed himself up in that ranch, and I watched it happen from 2 states away, and I couldn't reach him." A pause. "His letters this winter have been different. He sounds like himself again. The way he was before he lost her." She looked down at her coffee cup. "I needed to see why." Amelia held the woman's gaze. "And," she said. Helen looked at her for a long moment. She looked at her the way Colton looked at things, completely, without rushing. "You're not what I expected," she said. "People say that," Amelia said. "Usually they mean it as a criticism." "I don't," Helen said. She tilted her head slightly. "He said you were capable. He said you were honest. He said you were the best cook he'd ever encountered." Which from Colton is more significant than it sounds, because he has spent 30 years genuinely not caring what he ate. She paused. He also said you were the bravest person he knew. Amelia absorbed that in silence. He didn't say you were beautiful, Helen said. Not in the letter. But he wrote your name the way a man writes the name of someone he thinks is beautiful. Whether he uses that word or not. She looked at Amelia with something that was beginning to shade toward warmth. I think my brother is right about you. I think he has been right about very few things in his life that weren't cattle or fences. So I'm inclined to trust him when he is. Amelia set her hands on the counter. She had faced many kinds of assessment in her life, most of them unkind. Some of them neutral, very few of them genuinely curious. Helen Foss was genuinely curious. She was trying to understand something real, not confirm something she already believed. I'm going to be honest with you, Mrs. Foss, Amelia said. Because I've found it's the only thing worth being. Please, Helen said. I love your brother, Amelia said. She had not said those words aloud to anyone yet, not to Pearl. Not to Clara, not to Colton himself, because they hadn't needed them yet. They were good at meaning things without saying them. But they were the true words, and Helen Foss deserved the true words. I love him for the reasons that matter, and not for the reasons that are easy. He's difficult sometimes and too quiet sometimes, and he spent a long time being someone who needed to be convinced that he was allowed to want something good. She paused. I understand that. I spent a long time that way myself. She looked at Helen. I'm going to take care of him. And Clara. And I'm going to let them take care of me. Which is the part that I'm still learning. She held the woman's gaze. Is that enough? Helen Foss looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, will you teach me how to make whatever that is? She nodded at the bread behind the counter. The sourdough, Amelia said. He's been buying it every Thursday for over a year, Helen said. I'd like to know what my brother has been going out of his way for. Amelia looked at her. She looked at the bread. She thought about what Clara had said. He says it's the best bread he's ever eaten, and about the way some things circle back. Come back this afternoon, she said. After the lunch crowd. I'll show you. Helen picked up her coffee cup and smiled for the first time, a real smile. The kind that rearranged her face into something warmer than the composed exterior had suggested. Good, she said. I was hoping you'd say that. Helen Foss stayed 5 days. She stayed in the boarding house, and she came to the diner every morning, and she went out to the ranch every afternoon. And by the 3rd day, she and Clara had established a relationship of mutual, wary respect that looked by the 5th day like the beginning of something that might eventually become genuine affection. Clara taught Helen to check a horse's feet for stones. Helen taught Clara a card game she'd learned in Kansas City that Clara won on the first try and then was gracious about, which Helen said was better sportsmanship than most adults she knew. Colton, discovering that his sister had arrived unannounced and was conducting what amounted to an independent assessment of his life choices, said nothing for approximately 30 seconds. Then he said, Helen, you could have written, and given you time to rehearse, Helen said. No, I don't rehearse things, I know, she said. That's why I didn't need to warn you. She looked at him with the directness of a sister who has watched her brother closely for a long time and has few illusions about him. She's right for you, Colton. You know that. I know that. I just wanted to know it for myself. Colton looked at her for a moment. And you should stop waiting until spring, Helen said. Marry her in April. It's warmer than March, and she's not the type to need 6 months of planning. Colton did not say anything. But when he came to the diner the next Thursday morning, he sat at the counter and put both hands around his coffee cup and said, without preamble, Helen thinks April. What do you think? Amelia said. He looked at her. I think April, he said. Then April, she said. On the first Sunday of April, Amelia Whitaker married Colton Hayes in the Red Hollow Church with Reverend Morrison presiding and enough of the county present that Pearl had to set up an overflow table outside. Helen Foss stood up with Amelia. Ed Briggs stood with Colton. Clara sat in the front pew in a new dress that Amelia had helped her choose blue. because Clara had asked for blue and held herself with the particular composure of someone who is feeling a great deal and has decided to feel it with dignity. There were people in that church who had talked about Amelia Whitaker in ways that did not reflect well on them. There were people who had laughed. There were people who had looked at her 2 years ago on the stage from Billings and made a calculation about what she was worth and arrived at a number that was much too small. They were there too. And they watched Colton Hayes stand beside Amelia Whitaker at the front of that church and look at the way he looked at the things he was most certain about. And they understood something that cannot be argued with because it is simply present. Simply true. Simply the reality of two people standing in the same space and fitting together in a way that requires no explanation. Dora Hatch cried. She would later say it was the flowers. And no one believed her, and it didn't matter. Ruth Garrity sat beside her husband and held his hand, and did not cry but looked at Amelia during the vows with an expression that held, quietly, the acknowledgement of a debt that could not be repaid but could be remembered. Margaret Collins sat 3 rows back in a goods dress and watched the ceremony with the focused attention of a woman who is learning something. Even now at this late stage, May Sutton, who had driven in from her property with James, put her hand over her heart. At the moment Colton reached out and straightened a piece of Amelia's hair with the same quiet gesture he had used on her coat collar in February. The gesture that was so natural and so certain that it was invisible unless you were looking for it. Amelia was looking at Colton when he did it. She saw nothing else in the room. The reception was in the church hall. And Amelia had made most of the food herself because that was who she was, and she was not going to stop being who she was, simply because she was the bride. Pearl had argued with her about it. Helen had tried to intervene. Clara had sided with Amelia, which had settled the matter, because Clara siding with someone had, over the past several months, become the most reliable indicator of which side of any argument was correct. There was bread. Of course there was bread, the sourdough, and the dark rye she made in cold weather, and a sweet braided loaf that had been her mother's recipe. The one she made on occasions that deserved to be marked. There were pies and biscuits and the oatmeal cookies, with the dark sugar and cinnamon, which Clara had gotten very good at making under supervision, and which she had contributed to the table with the pride of someone who has made a thing with their hands and knows it is good. Harlan Pruitt ate 3 pieces of pie in a row and said they were the best thing he'd eaten since his wife died 11 years ago, which everyone took as the highest possible compliment he was capable of offering. Tom Garrity made a toast that went longer than it needed to, but was genuinely warm, which was better than the reverse. Ed Briggs said almost nothing, which was his way, but he shook Amelia's hand at the end of the evening with both of his, and held it long enough that she understood what he meant. Helen, leaving for the stage the next morning, hugged Amelia in the doorway of the ranch house and said, "Low and direct, take care of each other." Then she let go and stepped back and looked at her with clear eyes. "He's better when you're in the room. He's been better all winter. But when you walk in, there's something that happens in him that doesn't happen any other time." She paused. "I wanted you to know that, in case you ever needed to know it." Amelia held that and did not say anything until she could say something true. "Thank you for coming," she said finally. "Even unannounced." "Especially unannounced," Helen said. And she smiled and went to find her bags. The twist that none of them had prepared for came 3 weeks after the wedding, in the form of a letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office addressed to Colton Hayes, and in a separate envelope to Amelia Hayes. She was still adjusting to that name, still feeling the slight surprise of it each time. Like a garment that fits perfectly, but is new enough that you are still aware of wearing it. The letter in Amelia's envelope was brief and formal and said, in the careful language of official correspondence, that in the course of the investigation into the land records fraud, her role in securing the relevant documentation had been recognized, and that the Attorney General's office wished to acknowledge the public service she had rendered. It was signed by the Attorney General himself. She read it twice. She set it on the table. Clara, who had been watching from across the kitchen with the alert attention of someone who reads the room before asking questions, said, "Is it good news?" "It's yes," Amelia said. "It's good news. Can I see?" Amelia handed it to her. Clara read it carefully, the way she read everything. Then she looked up with an expression that was not the controlled composure she usually carried. It was something younger and more open, something that looked, for a moment, like the face of a child who has just understood that the world can sometimes give back what it has taken. "They know it was you," Clara said. "They know it was both of us," Amelia said. Clara looked at the letter again. She set it back on the table with the careful precision she gave things that mattered. "I'm going to tell Ed," she said, and was out the door before Amelia could respond. Amelia heard her voice in the yard, clear and certain, calling Ed Briggs's name, and sat for a moment in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the smell of the bread she started an hour ago and the sounds of the ranch around her. Hooves on packed earth, a door somewhere, the distant sound of cattle. Colton came in from outside. He had read his own letter. He set it on the table beside hers and looked at both of them for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Alderman pled to 3 counts yesterday," he said. "Garrett sent word this morning. Whitfield has cooperated with the investigation in exchange for leniency. The land records are being restored." He paused. "The ranch is clean." "Amelia, the title is clean. It's over." She looked at him. She thought about the night of the fever, when she had knelt beside his bed in a house where no one else had come. She thought about the letter that had brought her to Red Hollow, and the day in the yard, and the stage back to town, and the 2 years of bread and Thursday mornings, and everything that had been built so quietly and so carefully that it had looked from the outside like nothing, until it was everything. She stood up. She crossed the kitchen. She put both hands on the front of his coat and looked at him the way she looked at the things she was most certain about. "It's over," she agreed. He put his arms around her. Not tentatively, not with the careful restraint of a man who is still deciding whether he is allowed. With the certainty of someone who has made his choice and is done second-guessing it. She stood in the kitchen of the Hayes Ranch, her kitchen. Now her home now, and let herself be held, and she felt the particular quality of a moment that does not need anything added to it. Summer came in the way Montana summers come, sudden and total. The cold giving way almost overnight to heat and the long golden light that made the grass look like it was lit from underneath. The ranch was full. Ed Briggs, who had never been given to unnecessary conversation, had somehow, over the past several months, developed the habit of stopping in the kitchen in the morning for a cup of coffee before the day started. And he and Amelia had a standing arrangement where she told him what she needed from the supply run, and he told her what he'd heard about the weather. And neither of them ever acknowledged that this was a ritual that mattered to both of them. Clara had begun her lessons with the tutor, whose name was Miss Evan, and who had, within the first week, identified Clara as the most efficient student she had ever taught and proceeded to work accordingly. Clara came home from lessons with books under her arm and opinions she hadn't had the previous week. And she talked about them at dinner with the focused intensity of a person who has been given the right kind of fuel. The bunkhouse hands had, gradually and without any formal acknowledgement, formed a habit of appearing near the kitchen at certain hours. Amelia had been feeding people her whole adult life, and she understood exactly what was happening. They were coming because the food was good. And they were staying in the vicinity of the kitchen because the kitchen was warm in more than one way. And she let it happen without comment because feeding people was something she was good at, and she was not going to stop being good at things, simply because she had a different last name now. One Tuesday in July, she was rolling out dough when she heard boots on the porch, more than one set, more than the usual rhythm, and looked up to find 3 of the hands at the kitchen door, with their hats in their hands, and the collective expression of men who have drawn lots to determine who has to ask a question. The one in front, a young man named Pete, who had been on the ranch for 2 years, and who had the perpetually sunburned look of someone who has spent significant time outdoors and very little time thinking about hats, said, "Ma'am, we were wondering there's a man in Harlan Pruitt's bunkhouse. One of his summer hands, who got his arm caught in a fence mechanism this morning, and it looks bad. Harlan sent to the ranch to ask if you—" "Give me 5 minutes," Amelia said. She was already wiping her hands. "Tell Ed to get the horse ready." Pete's face went through visible relief. "Yes, ma'am, and Pete," she said. He turned back. "Cover that dough with the cloth on the second shelf. Don't let it sit out." "Yes, ma'am," he said, with the earnestness of someone who has been given a responsibility and intends to honor it. She had her medicine bag and her coat and was out the door in 4 minutes. Colton was in the yard when she came down the steps. He had heard Pete's report from Ed and had already saddled both horses, because he was a man who understood when something needed to happen without discussion. He looked at her as she took the reins. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough that Harlan sent over instead of handling it himself," she said. "Harlan doesn't ask for help." "No," Colton agreed. "He doesn't." They rode together toward the Pruitt property. And the summer morning opened up around them, wide and gold and indifferent to the smallness of human troubles and the largeness of human effort, and Amelia felt, riding beside this man on this land that was her land now, a thing she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like herself. Not the version of herself that survived. Not the version that persisted in the face of other people's assessments. The version that existed underneath all of that, the one who had been there since before the diner, and before Red Hollow, and before the newspaper advertisement, and before every person who had looked at her and seen less than what was there. The version her mother had known. She had not lost her. She had just been keeping her safe until there was somewhere safe enough to bring her back out. The hand at Harlan Pruitt's ranch had a deep laceration and a fractured wrist and a very strong opinion about whether he needed a doctor, which Amelia overrode with the particular efficiency of a woman who has learned that the kindest thing you can do for a person who is frightened is to simply start doing the next necessary thing without stopping to argue about it. Harlan stood in the doorway while she worked and watched with the alert stillness of an old man who has seen a great deal and is still capable of being impressed. When she had finished and the hand had been settled with instructions and a stern look that made clear she would hear about it if he moved the arm before she said he could, Harlan walked her out to where the horses were tied. "You're good at that," he said. "My mother taught me," she said. "Smart woman," he said, which was what he always said about her mother. Every time she came up, Amelia had stopped feeling surprised by it and had started feeling the particular warmth of hearing something true repeated. Harlan looked at Colton, who was holding the horses, and had known better than to come inside and offer to help with something Amelia had well in hand. "You got a good one," Harlan said. "I know it," Colton said. "Make sure you keep knowing it," Harlan said. He went back inside. Colton looked at Amelia. She looked back. The summer morning was everywhere around them, and there was work to get back to, and there always would be. And they both knew it, and neither of them moved for just a moment, just long enough to let the moment be what it was. "Ready," he said. "Ready," she said, that evening. After dinner, after Clara had gone to bed with a book, and Ed had made his last round of the property, and the ranch had settled into the particular quiet of a working place at the end of a day. Amelia stood at the kitchen window with a cup of tea going cool in her hand and looked out at the dark. The lamp by the door was lit. It was always lit now. She had started that habit the first week. Coming from she couldn't say exactly where, just the sense that a light left on in a window was the most fundamental form of welcome. The oldest way a house said someone is here, and they are expecting you back. She thought about the diner, and the narrow room above it, and the 4 o'clock mornings. She thought about the boarding house in Billings, and the stage, and the advertisement in the newspaper. She thought about her mother's kitchen, which was the first place she had ever understood that feeding people was not just a practical act, but a form of love. The most honest one, she knew. She heard Colton come into the kitchen behind her. She did not turn around. She felt him stop just behind her shoulder and look at the same dark she was looking at. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "My mother," she said. "She would have loved this kitchen." "Tell me about her," he said. She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the counter, with his arms crossed and his eyes on her. And he had the look he always had, when he asked her questions, the look of a man who has time and intends to spend it well. She thought about where to begin. "She was the smartest person I ever knew," she said. "And the best cook, and the most frightening when she needed to be." She looked at him. "She would have liked you." She didn't have patience for dishonest people. And she had a great deal of patience for men who were difficult but fair. A pause. "She would have told you that you waited too long." Colton looked at her for a moment. "She'd have been right," he said. "Yes," Amelia said. "She usually was." He unfolded his arms and crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the window, and looked at the same lamp she had been looking at. "She'd have liked that light," he said. "She would have," Amelia agreed. "She always said a dark house is a sad one. This one isn't sad," he said. She looked at the lamp. She thought about the night she had ridden 8 miles in the dark to a house where no one had come. And about all the mornings after. And about the bread and the Thursday mornings and the courthouse and the letter Clara had pulled from a pocket and the April wedding in a church full of people who had revised their understanding of something important. She thought about what it meant to belong somewhere. Not to be tolerated, not to be permitted, to belong in the full sense of the word. The way a thing belongs in the right place, fitting without effort or apology. Present without explanation. "No," she said, "it's not." She reached out and took his hand, and the lamp burned in the window, and outside the Montana dark was full of the sounds of a summer night on working land, the cattle, the horses, the wind that had come down from the mountains and was moving through the grass in long, slow waves, and inside the kitchen it was warm, and the bread she had made that morning was on the shelf. And Clara was asleep with a book in the next room. And the man beside her held her hand with the certainty of someone who has made a choice he will not revisit. Amelia Whitaker Hayes had come to Red Hollow 2 years ago with $14 and a medicine chest and a newspaper advertisement worn soft from handling. Looking for a place she was allowed to be. She had stopped looking. She was already there.